His mother lost her farm. The bank took everything. He was 18 years old, with nothing but calloused hands and a burning vow that if he ever had the chance, he would never just stand by and watch it happen to someone else. 12 years later, with every dollar he had ever earned, he made good on that promise. For a woman he'd never met, on a ranch he'd never set foot on. And in doing so, he didn't just save her home, he found his own. This is the story of two people who each had everything taken from them and built something greater together than either could have imagined alone. This channel exists for the dreamers, the fighters, and the tender-hearted stories from the frontier where love runs as deep as the prairie is wide, and where the human spirit refuses, no matter the cost, to give up. What Eliza and Caleb teach us is timeless. The right partner doesn't make your life easier, they make it worth it. If this story found its way to your heart, like the video, share it with someone you love, drop a comment below, and subscribe, because the next story is already waiting for you.
That morning had started out like any other kind of bad dream. Eliza Hartley stood by the kitchen window looking out. Her daddy's coffee cup was still on the shelf where he had left it 6 months ago. A fine layer of dust had formed a ring around its base, like a little monument to the man who was gone. Outside, the New Mexico sun was already beating down hard on land so parched it was cracking like an old leather saddle. The well was getting dangerously low, the cattle were skinny, and the bank's letter, the third one, was sitting on the table. She didn't have to read it again. The words were burned right into her mind. Final notice. The amount due was $2,300. If she failed to pay by October the 15th, they would seize the property and everything on it. October the 15th was today. She knew this day was coming. She could feel it on the horizon, like a big old dust storm you can see but just can't outrun. For 4 long months, she had scraped and fought for every penny. She sold off anything that wasn't bolted down. She worked her fingers to the bone to keep the ranch afloat and make payments, but it was never enough. The drought had made sure of that. Then there was the cattle sickness that came through back in August. On top of it all, she was a 23-year-old woman, all by herself in a place that didn't have much respect for youth or for women when it came to land and money. Her father, Thomas Hartley, had built this ranch from nothing over 30 years. He had carved a life right out of the dirt with plain old stubbornness. He raised horses that were famous 3 territories away for their grit and spirit. The man had lived through Apache raids, terrible droughts, and blizzards that could kill dozens of livestock in one night. He survived it all, only to be taken by a simple, senseless accident. A spooked horse and a rock in the wrong place had ended his life last March. Her mother, Sarah Hartley, followed him into the grave just 2 months later. It was like her heart just gave up, deciding it didn't want to be in a world without him. That left Eliza all alone, an orphan, who inherited not just a ranch, but also a big debt. Her father had taken out the loan to grow the horse breeding business. It was a gamble that would have paid off handsomely if he had just lived long enough to see it through. But he hadn't. The sound of wagon wheels crunching on the dry ground pulled her away from the window. Her stomach felt like it dropped right through the floor. They were here. 2 carriages, black as buzzards, rolled up the long drive with the Territorial Bank seal painted on the side. Dust kicked up behind them in angry-looking clouds. 4 men got out. 3 of them were strangers, dressed in city suits that looked ridiculous in the heat. The 4th man she knew all too well. It was Vernon Hastings, the bank manager. He was a man whose smile never quite made it to his eyes and whose handshake always felt cold and lifeless. Eliza took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked out onto the porch. The heat hit her like a solid wall, even though it wasn't even 9 o'clock in the morning. The wooden boards under her boots, boards her own father had put down with his own 2 hands, creaked with a sound that seemed to echo her sorrow. She stood there at the top of the steps and just waited, clasping her hands together in front of her to stop them from shaking. Hastings walked up first, taking off his hat in a way that might have looked polite if it weren't for the greedy shine in his eyes. "Miss Hartley," he said. and his voice carried across the yard with that fake sympathy people use right before they tear your life apart. "I am truly sorry it has to be this way." "Are you really?" Eliza heard herself say. Her voice sounded much stronger than she felt. For just a second, something changed in Hastings's face. It might have been annoyance, or maybe he was amused. "The bank gave you every chance to take care of this debt. Your father was a good customer for many years. We gave him credit because we trusted him." "My father died trying to build something," Eliza said. "I have been trying to finish what he started." "And with what money?" Hastings asked, spreading his hands wide. "Miss Hartley, you are 4 months behind on your payments. The total amount you owe, with interest and all the fees, is now $2,300. Do you have that money?" The question just hung there in the hot, still air. "You know I do not," Eliza said softly. "Then I am afraid we have no other choice but to begin foreclosure," Hastings said. He motioned to the men standing behind him. "This is Mr. Pembroke, our assessor. He will be making a list of the property and assets for the auction. I'm going to need you to be off the premises by sundown." The words felt like they hit her physically. Off the property by sundown. This was the house where she was born, where her mother taught her how to read, where her father told her stories by the fire about the old days, about building something that would last. And it would all be gone by tonight. "This is my home," Eliza said, and she hated how weak her own voice sounded. "This is collateral," Hastings corrected her. "And as of today, it belongs to the Territorial Bank." One of the other men, Pembroke, was already taking out a leather-bound book and a pencil. He glanced around the property with the cold, bored look of a man counting furniture in a storeroom. The third man, who was younger and had a deputy's badge on his vest, just stood there with his hand on his gun, as if he expected Eliza to suddenly cause a problem. "The horses," she said, her voice urgent. "At least let me keep my horses. They are not really part of the ranch. They are my breeding stock. My father kept separate records for the horse business." Hastings smiled then, and it was a whole lot worse than a frown. "Everything on this property is considered collateral, Miss Hartley. The horses, the cattle, the tools, all of it will be sold at auction to cover the debt. If there is any money left over after the bank gets what it is owed, you will receive it. Though if I were you, I would not count on there being much." Of course there would not be. The bank would see to that. They would lowball the value of everything, sell it to their friends for next to nothing, and she would be left without a dime. Not even enough for a train ticket back east. Eliza felt something inside her chest just break. It was the last little piece of hope she had been holding on to, and it finally shattered. "How much time do I have?" she asked. "Mr. Pembroke's assessment should take about 3, maybe 4 hours," Hastings replied. "I will need you to stay here during that time in case he has any questions. After that," he shrugged his shoulders, "I suggest you gather whatever personal belongings you can carry and find a place to stay somewhere else. The ranch house itself will be locked up tight." "And where exactly am I supposed to go?" "That, Miss Hartley, is not the bank's problem." The casual cruelty in his voice stole her breath. She had known Vernon Hastings for years. She had seen him at church gatherings and at the 4th of July picnics in town. Her father used to play poker with him. And now here he was standing in her yard, taking her whole life apart, and he could not even bother to act like he cared one bit. Pembroke was already heading toward the barn, his book open, scribbling notes. The deputy stayed near the carriages, watching Eliza with the tired expression of a man who had done this many times before and figured he would do it many times again. "I will need to get into the house," Hastings said, "to take inventory of what is inside." Eliza wanted to tell him to go straight to hell. She wanted to slam the door right in his face, lock it, and dare them to try and break it down. But that would just make the deputy draw his gun, and then she would not even have until sundown. She would just be dragged off to jail, and everything would end up the same way. So she just stepped to the side. Hastings walked up the porch steps, his boots thudding heavily on the wood. He stopped at the door and glanced back at her. For what it is worth, he said, I did try to talk the board into giving you more time. But you are young, you are not married, and you have no male relatives to speak for you. The bank simply cannot afford to keep accounts that do not make a profit. How very kind of you to try, Eliza said, her voice flat. Hastings' thin smile disappeared. Being bitter is not going to help your situation, Miss Hartley. Then he went inside. Through the open doorway, Eliza could hear him moving around in the house. Her house. She could hear drawers opening and him making notes, cataloging her life like it was just merchandise in a general store. She stood there on the porch, frozen by a sadness so big it felt like it would swallow her whole. All around her, the ranch that had been her entire world was slowly dying. The windmill that needed fixing creaked in the hot breeze. The fence along the east pasture was sagging where the posts had rotted out. The garden her mother had loved was now just a patch of brown, dead weeds. Everything her father had built, everything he had died, everything she fought to keep was already lost. Far off, she watched Pembroke step into the barn. She could picture exactly what he was looking at in there. 8 horses, 2 of them mares about to drop their foals, and Ranger, the stallion her daddy had paid a king's ransom for 3 years back. They were beautiful animals, every last one. And now they would be sold off one by one, likely to folks who couldn't tell a horse's head from its tail. The whole breeding line her father had poured his life into would just vanish like dust in the wind. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, trying to get a breath past the rock in her chest. So this was it. This was how it all came apart, not with a bang, but with a stack of papers and quiet men in suits taking everything apart, piece by measured piece. Her father's whole dream was now just a few numbers on a page. A noise from the house snapped her eyes open. A floorboard creaked, which meant Hastings was now in her daddy's study, rummaging through his desk. She knew she ought to go in there to make sure they weren't pocketing anything, but she just couldn't make herself do it. She couldn't stand to see their strange hands on her father's belongings. So she walked off the porch and into the dusty yard instead. She just had to move, to do anything besides stand there and let it all happen. The sun was climbing, promising another day of blistering heat. October in New Mexico was supposed to be a break from the summer scorch, but this year the drought just wouldn't let go. The sky was a pale, hard blue without a single cloud. No rain was coming. No help was coming either. Eliza found herself walking up toward the little family cemetery on the hill overlooking the whole ranch. It was inside a wrought iron fence her daddy had a blacksmith in Santa Fe make special. Her mama and daddy were buried there right next to each other, each. They were resting under 2 matching headstones. Thomas Hartley, 1821 to 1886. Sarah Hartley, 1825 to 1886. She stood right there at the foot of their graves, just wondering what they would think of all this. Would her daddy be ashamed of her for losing his ranch? Would her mama tell her that she had done all she could? "I'm so sorry," Eliza whispered to the quiet stones. "I tried. Lord knows I really did try." A hot, dry wind kicked up, blowing dust across the little hilltop. She could hear Hastings yelling to Pembroke across the flat land, their voices carrying as they took stock of everything they were taking away. She had no idea how long she stood there on that hill. Time had stretched and twisted. It felt like forever and no time at all. The sun just beat down on her. Sweat ran in a line down her back. Her throat felt like sandpaper. But the idea of going back to the house for a drink of water, a house that wasn't really hers anymore, was just too much to bear. It was Hastings' voice that finally broke through her thoughts. "Miss Hartley, I need you back at the house now." She turned to see him on the porch, waving a hand like he was shooing a stray dog. With heavy feet, she started back down the hill. When she got closer, she saw Pembroke was back from the barn, his little book now full of scribbled notes. The deputy was standing in the shade of a carriage, his hat pulled down low. "I'll need you to sign these papers," Hastings said, shoving a stack of documents at her. They just acknowledge you got the foreclosure notice and that you agree with the inventory. Eliza stared at the words, but they didn't make any sense. And if I refuse to sign? Then the deputy here will just make a note of it, and the foreclosure will go on just the same. Your signature is just a courtesy, Miss Hartley. It is not a requirement. Of course it wasn't. She took the papers and the pencil he held out. Her hand trembled as she wrote out her name, Eliza Jane Hartley, on all the lines they showed her. Every time she wrote it felt like a little piece of her died. There now, Hastings said, sounding pleased as he snatched the papers back. That is all settled. Mr. Pembroke, what is the final number? My early figures put the total value of the assets at about $1,800, Pembroke said, his voice thin and whiny. That takes into account the state of the buildings, the animals, and what things are selling for right now. $1,800. For a ranch her daddy took 30 years to build. For horses that were worth twice that amount if you sold them right. For a house that had been home to 3 generations of her family. That hardly covers the debt, Hastings said with a frown. What about just the horses? The breeding animals ought to fetch a high price. Not in this market, Pembroke shot back. This drought is hurting everybody. No one is buying what they call luxury items like thoroughbred horses when they can barely feed the animals they already have. Luxury items. That is what he called her father's whole life. Well, I suppose we will just have to take what we can get, Hastings said. He looked back at Eliza. The auction is next Saturday in town. You can come if you like, although I can't imagine you would want to. How very thoughtful of you, Eliza said, her voice completely empty. Hastings pulled out his pocket watch. It is almost noon. I believe we are done here, Miss Hartley. You have until the sun goes down to get your personal things out of the house. Anything still here after that belongs to the bank. 6 hours. She had 6 hours to go through 23 years of her life and figure out what she could take with her. I'll need a wagon, she said, to move my belongings. I am afraid the wagon is considered part of the ranch's assets, Hastings said. It has already been counted. Then how am I supposed to move my things? You could rent a wagon in town, or maybe a neighbor might lend you one. The way he said it made it clear he knew that would never happen. Out here, helping someone the bank was taking from was a sure way to get on the wrong side of the very people who held your own loans. Eliza felt hot tears welling up, and she blinked them back hard. She would not let these men see her cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. Is there anything else? She asked. I'll need the keys to the house before I go. The house is not locked. It will be. The bank is having new locks put on tomorrow. Hastings held out his hand, waiting. The whole thing was so ridiculous, Eliza almost laughed. She had never locked her doors a day in her life. Nobody out here did. But now the bank needed keys to lock up her home like it was a coffin. I do not have any keys, she told him. We have never needed them. Hastings let out a big sigh, like this was a huge problem just for him. Then I will have the locks put on today. You will need to be done moving your personal things in the next few hours. Before she could even answer, a new sound cut through the dead, hot air. It was the sound of a horse coming hard and fast. They all turned to look down the road. A rider was coming toward them, pushing his horse and kicking up a cloud of dust that looked like a plume of smoke. Eliza could tell even from far away that he was a big man, tall with broad shoulders, wearing one of those long, worn dusters that told you a man lived more in the saddle than under a roof. The rider did not slow down one bit as he got closer. In fact, he spurred his horse on, covering the last bit of road in a thunder of hooves before pulling back hard on the reins, stopping in a shower of dirt. The horse, a handsome bay gelding, sidestepped and snorted while the rider swung down from the saddle like he was born there. He was younger than she first thought, maybe in his early 30s, with skin tanned dark by the sun and eyes the color of a thunderhead. His jaw was covered in the shadow of a few days' growth of beard, and his clothes, while covered in trail dust, were made of fine material. A gun belt was slung low on his hips, the leather of the holster worn from plenty of practice. Hastings finally got his wind back and said, Well now, can I help you, sir? The stranger paid him no mind. His gaze had landed on Eliza, and a look of knowing, of worry, made her hold her breath. "Are you Miss Eliza Hartley?" he asked. His voice was deep with just a hint of an accent, like he grew up speaking Spanish first and English second. "I am," she replied, feeling mighty confused. "Do I know you?" "No, ma'am, but I know who you are. I've seen you around town." He glanced at the carriages, then at Hastings and Pembroke and the deputy, and his jaw set hard. "Are they foreclosing on you?" "That's not any of your business," Hastings said, all stiff and proper. "This is a matter for the bank. I'm making it my business." The stranger's hand came to rest near his gun belt. It wasn't a threat, not really, but you couldn't miss it. "Miss Hartley, are these men taking your ranch?" Eliza finally found her tongue. "Yes, I owe the bank some money, $2,300, and I just don't have it." The stranger's eyes, she saw now they were gray like a storm cloud, moved across her face. He was studying her with a power that ought to have felt wrong, but for some reason, it didn't. $2,300, he said quietly. "That's the full amount, including all the fees and interest that keeps piling up," Hastings cut in. "Now, Mr. I don't think I got your name." "Mercer," the stranger answered. "Caleb Mercer." He looked back at Eliza. "Ma'am, if you had the money this very second, would that stop all this? Would they just leave?" "Well, yes, but—" "How much, exactly?" Caleb broke in, his eyes locked on Hastings. The bank manager's face had gone completely blank. "As I said, $2,300 plus. I heard you the first time. If I hand you that whole amount in cash right now, do these men get off this land and let the lady keep her ranch?" A heavy quiet fell over the yard. Hastings was the first to snap out of it. "Well, yes, if the debt was settled in full, the foreclosure would have to be stopped. But, Mr. Mercer, I really must tell you—" "I'm not asking for a life story," Caleb said, his voice flat. "I'm asking if you'll take the money right now. And then, do you leave?" "Yes," Hastings said, and Eliza could hear the doubt plain in his voice. "But, Mr. Mercer, $2,300 is a mighty large sum. I seriously doubt—" Caleb Mercer was already reaching for his saddlebag. Eliza just stood there, stuck in place, as he pulled out not one, but two heavy leather pouches that clinked with the sound of metal as he moved. He strode right past Hastings over to where Pembroke stood with his book, and he poured the contents of the first bag onto the carriage step. A waterfall of shiny gold coins tumbled out, glinting in the sunlight. "Start counting," Caleb told him. Pembroke just gawked at the money like he'd never laid eyes on a coin before. Hastings shoved him aside, his own eyes wide as saucers. "This is, where did you come by this?" "None of your concern," Caleb said, throwing Hastings' own words right back at him. "It's good money, isn't it? So get to counting." With hands that wouldn't stay still, Pembroke started sorting the coins into piles. Eliza watched, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the whole world could hear it. This just couldn't be real. This stranger, a man she'd never met in her life, couldn't be paying off her entire debt. Things like this just didn't happen. Not to her, not on this day. But the coins kept clinking as Pembroke counted, his lips moving without a sound. 1,000, he finally announced. Caleb tipped out the second pouch. More gold coins joined the first pile. 2,000. He produced a third, smaller pouch. 2,200. Caleb then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a fistful of silver dollars. "That ought to cover the rest of it, and your fees." The grand total came to $2,350. Hastings just glared at the money like it had done him a personal wrong. "Mr. Mercer, I have to tell you that this is extremely out of the ordinary. Taking on another person's debt without getting proper legal advice." "I don't need any legal advice," Caleb stated. "You said if the debt is paid, you leave. It's paid. So it's time for you to leave." There are rules to follow. Then follow them. Write up whatever papers you have to, but you'll be doing it knowing her debt is paid in full, which means this foreclosure business is over. Am I right?" Hastings' mouth flapped open and closed for a second. At last he choked out, "Yes. If the debt is completely paid, the foreclosure is stopped. But Mr. Mercer, you need to know that just by paying Miss Hartley's debt, you don't get any kind of claim on this property. The debt would just be moved over to you." "I know how debt works," Caleb cut him off. "Write your papers confirming you got the payment. Miss Hartley and I will sort out the details between ourselves." Eliza finally managed to speak. I don't understand what is going on." Caleb turned to face her, and for the first time since he rode up, the hard look on his face softened just a little. "What's going on is that these men are leaving, and you are keeping your ranch." "But why? You don't even know who I am." "No, ma'am," he agreed. "But I know what it's like to see somebody lose everything they've worked for to men who couldn't care less. And I happen to know I've got money I've been putting aside for some land. Seems to me this land right here is worth saving." It was crazy. It was impossible. But it was happening right in front of her. Hastings, realizing he had completely lost control of things, started gathering up the money with help from Pembroke, counting it all one more time to be sure. The deputy had stood up straight, his hand nowhere near his pistol now, just watching the whole thing unfold with a look of pure confusion. "I'll be needing a receipt," Caleb said. "Written out and signed, saying that the debt of $2,300 owed by Miss Eliza Hartley to the Territorial Bank has been paid in full on this day, October 15th, 1886. "I'll have to prepare the official documents back at the bank," Hastings grumbled. "Then you can bring them here tomorrow. But I want a signed receipt right now before you ride off." Hastings' jaw was set tight, but he pulled out a piece of paper and started to write. The scratching of his pen sounded awfully loud in the still yard. When he was done, he shoved the paper at Caleb, barely hiding his anger. Caleb took his time reading it before he folded it up and tucked it into his pocket. "It's been a pleasure doing business with you," he said, and his tone made it clear it had been anything but. Hastings turned to Eliza. "Miss Hartley, you should know that even though your immediate debt is taken care of, you now owe this money to Mr. Mercer. I highly recommend you talk to a lawyer about how you're going to pay him back." She'll run her own affairs the way she wants to," Caleb said before Eliza could even open her mouth. "Now, I do believe you gentlemen were on your way out." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Hastings looked like he wanted to put up a fight, but one look at Caleb Mercer standing there, as calm and solid as a mountain, seemed to make him reconsider. He gave a sharp nod to Pembroke and the deputy. "Pack up the books. We're finished here." The three men climbed back into their carriages, looking a whole lot less sure of themselves than when they had arrived. As the driver got ready to go, Hastings leaned out the window. "I will be back tomorrow with the official paperwork," he said. "I'm looking forward to it," Caleb called back. Eliza stood there frozen as the carriages trundled back down the path, kicking up dust behind them. She watched until they were just a speck on the horizon, until even the rumble of their wheels was gone. Then she turned to the man who had just saved her whole world, Caleb Mercer. He just stood there, his thumbs hooked in his belt loops, watching her with those storm-gray eyes. His horse, which he had forgotten all about during the whole mess, had found its way to the water trough and was drinking like it had crossed a desert. "I do not understand," Eliza said one more time. "Why on earth would you do that? You just paid $2,300 for what?" "For the chance to make you an offer," Caleb said. "That is, if you are willing to hear me out." "An offer?" "Yes, ma'am. But first, I figure we ought to get out of this sun. I have been riding since daybreak, and I reckon you have had a morning that was a whole lot rougher than you planned for." Eliza glanced back at the house. It was her house, and somehow it was still her house. She felt the tears welling up again. But this time it was not just sorrow she was feeling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, let us go inside." She led him up the wooden porch steps, her legs feeling unsteady and her mind just spinning. Behind them, Caleb's horse finished its drink and started chewing on the few sad little patches of grass left in the yard. The inside of the house was just as she had left it, or maybe how Hastings had left it, with drawers pulled halfway out and papers scattered all over from his inventory. A wave of shame washed over her, seeing the clutter and the poverty of it all through the eyes of a stranger. But Caleb did not seem to pay it any mind. He took off his hat the moment he stepped over the threshold and waited for her to show him where to go. "The kitchen," Eliza heard her own voice say. "I can put on some coffee." "That would be mighty fine, ma'am." She went through the old familiar motions, pumping water from the well, scooping the coffee grounds, and getting the fire going again in the stove. Her hands were shaking, but at least they had a job to do. From behind her, she heard Caleb ease himself into a chair at the kitchen table, the old wood groaning under his weight. "You said you had seen me in town," Eliza said, keeping her back to him. "When was that?" "A few times over this past year," Caleb answered. "You were usually coming in for supplies. I saw you once at the feed store when I was selling a horse to the owner, and another time at the church social last 4th of July. Eliza had a fuzzy memory of that day. It was one of the last times things had felt halfway normal before the crushing weight of all the debt and sadness took over everything. But she could not recall seeing him there. "I did not notice you," she confessed. "Most folks do not. I am not one to make a big show of myself." The coffee started to bubble. Eliza took down 2 cups, her father's and her mother's, the ones with the little blue flowers painted on them, and placed them on the table. "You said you have an offer for me," she said, finally turning around to look at him. In the light of the kitchen, Caleb Mercer seemed older, and the lines around his eyes were deeper. But his gaze was unwavering and honest. "I do, but before I say it, I have to ask you something. Do you truly want to keep this ranch?" "Of course I do," Eliza said, without a second thought. "This is my home. It's my father built this place. He died trying to protect it, but do you want to run it, or do you just want to hang on to it because it belongs to you?" The question took her by surprise. Both, I suppose. I know how to run this place. My father taught me everything. I can manage the horses and the breeding program, and the debt, the drought, and the fact that you will be 4 months behind all over again come February, unless something big changes." The plain, hard truth of his words felt like a slap across the face. "I will find a way. I will just work harder, sell more horses." "With what breeding stock?" Caleb asked, his voice soft. "Ma'am, forgive me for being so blunt, but I had a look in your barn when I rode in. You have got 8 horses, and 2 of them are pregnant mares. That is not nearly enough to run a breeding operation that turns a profit. Not in these times. Your father might have had the money and the right people to make it work, but you do not right now. Not." Eliza sank into the chair across from him, the fight going out of her. "So, what are you telling me? That I should just give up? No, I am telling you that you need some help, and I am offering to give it to you." The coffee pot let out a whistle. Eliza stood up like she was in a trance, poured 2 cups, and set one down in front of Caleb. The simple, everyday act felt completely out of place. "What kind of help?" she asked. Caleb cupped his hands around the warm mug, but did not take a drink. "I have been driving cattle for 12 years, he said. "I started when I was 18, working for outfits all over Texas and Colorado. I spent every season out on the trail, and I saved every single dollar I could. I have been searching for a piece of land to buy, a place to start my own operation. But good land is mighty hard to find. And when you do find it, there is always somebody else with more money or more connections who gets to it first. So, you want to buy my ranch?" "No." Caleb looked her straight in the eye. "I want to be your partner. A real partner. Legal partners. 50-50 ownership. I will put up the money I have been saving. There is plenty more where that $2,300 came from. You will put up the land, the horses you have now, and what you know about breeding. We will run this place together. We will share the profits. We will share the risk. And we will share the work." Eliza just stared at him. "You want to go into business with a person you do not even know. I know that you did not fall apart when your folks died. I know you have been fighting tooth and nail for 4 months to save this place. I know you stood up to those men from the bank, even when you had nothing left to fight with." He took a breath. "And I know you love this ranch enough to break your own heart trying to keep it. That tells me everything I need to know. But why? Why not just wait for the next foreclosure sale? You could buy somebody's land for yourself." "Because that is not the kind of man I am," Caleb said plainly. "I watched my own mother lose her farm after my father passed. I watched the bank take every last thing while the neighbors just stood by feeling sorry for her but not lifting a finger. I made a promise to myself that if I ever had the money, I would never just stand there and watch that happen to somebody else. Not if I could do something to stop it." Eliza's throat felt tight. "I cannot pay you back. Not $2,300. That would take me years. I am not asking you to pay me back. I am asking you to build something with me. If it works out, we both make money. If it goes under, we both lose. That is what being partners is all about." This was crazy. It was completely unbelievable. Going into business with a total stranger, giving away half the ownership of her father's ranch to a man she had just met 30 minutes ago. And still she asked, "What about the cattle? You said you have been driving cattle. I do not know the first thing about a cattle operation, and I do not know much about horse breeding past the basics," Caleb said. "But between the two of us, we would have it all covered. I bring in a herd of cattle and you build up the horse operation. This ranch has good access to water, even with the drought. That creek is fed by a deep spring. If we manage the herd right, we could run a small cattle operation right alongside your horses." The bank said the horses were not worth much in this market. The bank was trying to buy them from you for cheap. Your horses are worth a good deal to the right buyers. And I have connections with those buyers from my years on the cattle trails. I know ranchers who need good working horses and are willing to pay top dollar for animals that have proven bloodlines. Eliza's mind was racing. How would this work legally? How do I know you will not just try to take over everything once we are partners? We will have proper papers drawn up, 50-50 ownership, and an equal say in every decision we make. We can ride into town tomorrow, talk to a lawyer, and make it all official. If you want to add things in there to protect your interests, we will put them in. This is not charity, Miss Hartley. This is a business deal. I need land and an operation to put my money into. You need money and another pair of hands. We both need this to work. Why horses and cattle? Why not just stick to one or the other? To spread out the risk. Your father was a smart man to get into horse breeding, but he put too many of his eggs in one basket. The drought came, the cattle market went south, and all of a sudden nobody was buying fancy horses. But if you have both operations going, one can keep you afloat when the other one is having a hard time. It is just basic risk management. He was right, and Eliza knew he was. She had thought the exact same thing herself these last few months, as she watched her father's careful plans turn to dust, because they were all tied to a single market. "And you would live here?" she asked. "On the ranch?" "I would have to, if I am going to run an operation. That would... People would talk. Let them talk. We are business partners, not..." He stopped, and for the very first time Eliza saw a hint of red creep up his neck. "It would all be proper. I can sleep in the barn, or we can build a small cabin for me. Whatever makes the most sense." Eliza looked down into her coffee cup, her thoughts churning. This man had just saved her from losing absolutely everything. He was offering her a chance to not just get by, but maybe even to succeed. But saying yes meant changing her whole connection to her father's ranch, and it meant admitting that she could not do it all by herself. "Can I think about it?" she asked in a quiet voice. "Of course. You take all the time you need." Caleb waited a moment. "Well, maybe not all the time. The debt is paid for now, but winter is on its way. We would need to start making decisions about the livestock, feed supplies, and repairs that need doing. The longer we put it off, the harder it is going to get." "How long have you been planning this?" Eliza asked him out of the blue. Caleb had the good grace to look a little bit embarrassed. "About 2 months. Ever since I heard in town that you were falling behind on your payments. I asked around a bit, learned about your situation. I thought about coming to you sooner, but..." He shrugged. It just did not feel right to offer help before it was truly needed. And you just happened to show up today on this exact day. I knew the date of the foreclosure. It was not too hard to figure out when I needed to be here. That is quite a gamble you took. What if I had already lost the ranch before you showed up? Then I would have just bought it at the auction and offered you a job as my foreman, Caleb said plainly. Either way, it just seemed wrong to let good land and a fine horse operation fall to ruin. Eliza wasn't sure if she should be impressed by his straightforward thinking or a little unsettled by it. I need to see your assets, she said. If we're going to be partners, I have to know what you're bringing to the table besides the money you just paid on my debt. That's fair. Caleb got to his feet. I've got the papers right in my saddlebag. Bank records, letters of credit, a list of livestock I own that's currently with a cattle company up in Colorado. It should give you a good idea. They stepped back outside. The sun was past its highest point now, starting its slow journey toward the evening. Caleb's horse had found a cool spot in the shade and was resting on 3 legs. Caleb dug around in his saddlebag and pulled out a leather folder. Inside were papers, all neatly arranged. There were bank statements from accounts in Denver and Santa Fe, letters from cattle managers confirming he owned breeding bulls and several hundred head of mixed cattle. There was even a letter of recommendation from a Colorado rancher whose name Eliza knew well. She read through every single page, twice. The amounts were jaw-dropping. Even after paying off her debt, Caleb Mercer still had close to $4,000 in cash he could get to, plus livestock worth at least that much more. You've been saving up for a good long while, she said, since I was 18. Every dollar I didn't absolutely need for living went straight into the bank. I figured one day I'd have enough to buy my own piece of land outright. But like I said, good land is hard to find. And you're willing to gamble all of this on a partnership with a complete stranger. I'm willing to gamble it on someone who has proven she's not a quitter, Caleb corrected her. Sometimes that's worth a whole lot more than experience. Eliza handed her father's papers back. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. This was going to be the smartest thing she ever did, or the dumbest, and there was no telling which until the dust settled. If we're going to do this, she said, her voice steady, we need some ground rules, lines in the sand. I agree. The horses are mine to manage, she stated. That means breeding, selling, and training. That was my father's world, and now it is mine. And the cattle operation is your domain. But when it comes to the ranch as a whole, like big buys, land deals, or hiring help, we have to be in it together. What happens if we hit a wall and cannot agree? We talk it out until we find some middle ground. And if we are still stuck, we get somebody else to weigh in, maybe the lawyer, or someone we both see as fair. The terms were solid, better than she could have hoped for. Still, Eliza felt like she was staring down a long drop off a high canyon wall. Just one more thing, she said. Why is a man like you not married? Why are you way out here by yourself instead of building a life with a wife on your own ranch? A shadow crossed Caleb's face. I was set to be married once, about 5 years back. She figured out she did not want a husband who was gone 8 months of the year working cattle drives. I cannot hold it against her. This life is not for everybody. And you never looked for someone else? I spent these last 5 years saving every penny and learning this business top to bottom. It did not feel right to ask a woman to put her life on hold while I was building mine. He looked at her then. What is your story? You are a smart, capable woman. Why is there no husband here helping you keep this place running? Because the men I knew wanted a housekeeper, not a partner, Eliza answered plainly. They wanted a woman to cook their meals and raise their children while they ran the show. My daddy taught me how to run a ranch, how to read a contract, and how to breed a fine horse. Most men found that more scary than appealing. Well, that is their loss, Caleb said, and it sounded like he truly believed it. They stood there in the yard as the afternoon sun beat down. Two strangers thinking about tying their futures together. I need a day, Eliza said at last. To think on this with a clear head, to make sure I am not just grasping at straws after nearly losing it all today. That is a smart play, Caleb agreed. I will ride on into town, get a room for the night, and be back in the morning. You can tell me your decision then. If you say yes, we will ride to the lawyer's office together. If it is no, he gave a small shrug. The debt is still paid. That will give you some room to breathe and figure out what to do next. So if I say no, you would just ride away after putting up $2,300. You can call it a down payment on doing the right thing, Caleb said. Sometimes that is all the reward you get. He took his horse's reins and swung up into the saddle like he was born there. Looking down at her, his face was serious, but his eyes were gentle. Miss Hartley, I know this is a whole lot to swallow, and I have given you no reason to trust me outside of my actions today. But I need you to know if we do this, I am all in. I do not back out of a partnership, and I do not give up on the land. Your father made something here that is worth fighting for. It would be my honor to help you see it through. Before Eliza could find her voice, he gave a slight tip of his hat and pointed his horse toward the main road. She stood and watched him go, the dust kicking up from the bay's hooves until he was just a speck on the horizon, and then he was gone. She turned back to her ranch, somehow still her own. The barn roof was missing shingles. The fence lines were in bad need of mending. The well pump was making a terrible grinding sound that promised trouble. The pastures were burnt brown by the drought, and the cattle market was at rock bottom with winter just around the corner. But the ranch was still standing, and it was still hers. The real question was if it ought to stay that way, or if taking on a partner was the wiser, more courageous path. Eliza went back inside the quiet house. Her father's old coffee cup was still on the shelf where he left it, covered in a thin layer of dust. She picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. "What would you do, Papa?" she whispered to the empty room. But deep down, she already knew. Her father was a practical man above all else. He worked with other ranchers when it was smart. He borrowed money when he had to, and he hired good men and paid them what they were worth. He never let his pride stop him from doing what needed to be done. Eliza put the cup down and walked into her father's study. The papers that Hastings had thrown around were still a mess on the floor. Loan agreements, breeding charts, and letters from buyers in 3 different territories. She spent the rest of the day putting everything back in order, reading her father's notes. She began to understand for the very first time how big this operation was, and how one person could never hope to handle it alone. As the sun went down, painting the New Mexico sky with streaks of orange and deep red, Eliza stood on the porch. She watched the land her father cherished fade into the evening shadows. Caleb Mercer would be back tomorrow, and she would have her answer for him. Eliza was awake long before sunrise, her mind made up. She could not say exactly when the decision had formed. Maybe it was when she was looking at her father's careful breeding records, all those years of work that could not just be thrown away. Or maybe it was just the plain and simple truth that Caleb Mercer had shown up right when she was about to go under. And turning your back on that kind of luck felt not only foolish but disrespectful to whatever sent him her way. She put on her sturdiest work clothes, a split riding skirt and one of her father's old work shirts with the sleeves rolled up. She went out to see to the horses before the day got too hot. The morning air had a crisp chill to it, a little warning that winter was coming, ready or not. Ranger, the big stallion, nickered a soft welcome when she came to his stall. She stroked his powerful neck, feeling the strong muscles under his shiny coat that had made her father so proud. "We are going to make it," she whispered to him. "I really think we are going to be all right." The horse just snorted and nudged her, far more concerned with his morning oats than her words of comfort. She had just finished feeding and watering all 8 horses when the sun finally broke over the distant hills, spilling gold light across the yard. She was hauling buckets from the well when she heard the sound of a lone rider on the road. Caleb Mercer appeared with the rising sun behind him, looking for all the world like a hero from a storybook. His horse moved with a long, steady gait, a sign of a seasoned trail horse. And Caleb sat in the saddle with the easy comfort of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. He pulled up near the porch, his gaze finding hers right away. "Morning, Miss Hartley." "Morning." Eliza set the heavy buckets down and wiped her dusty hands on her skirt. "You are here early. I did not want to burn daylight if your mind was made up." He stopped, and she could see the tightness in his shoulders, even though he tried to sound relaxed. "Is it?" "It is." Eliza drew in a long breath. "My answer is yes. I will take you up on your offer of a partnership." A change came over Caleb's face. It looked like relief, but he hid it well. He swung down from his horse and stood there, facing her from across the dusty ground. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "No second guessing?" "Plenty of second guessing," Eliza confessed. "But my first thought is the one that is winning. I cannot do this by myself, and what you are offering is a fair deal. It is more than fair, especially since you paid my debt with no promise I would agree to anything." "Then we ought to ride to town," Caleb said. "Get this all down on paper before something else goes sideways." "Should I go saddle a horse?" "It might be better if we take the wagon. We have papers to carry with us, and we'll have more to bring back. Unless your wagon was already—" "No," Eliza cut in. Hastings was lying through his teeth about that. "The wagon is mine. I just did not have the fight in me to argue with him over every little thing." A small smile played on Caleb's lips. "That was smart. You have to pick your fights." They hitched her wagon, a solid rig her father had built with his own 2 hands, and started down the road to town. The ride was mostly quiet for the first little while. It was clear that neither one of them knew quite what to say now that things had changed. They were not strangers anymore, but they were not exactly partners yet either. They were caught somewhere in between, and the silence felt heavy with possibility. At last, Caleb spoke. "Tell me about your horses, about the breeding program. What was your father trying to build?" Eliza shot him a sideways glance, thankful he had picked a simple topic. "He wanted to create a line of horses that had the grit of a Mustang but the size and build of a thoroughbred. He wanted working horses that could handle a long day in rough country, but were also smart and quick enough for ranch work. He had been working on it for 15 years, choosing his bloodlines with great care." "Ranger is your main stallion, then?" "Yes. Papa bought him from a man in Kentucky. It took nearly every cent he had at the time, but he always said that the moment he saw that horse, he knew. He said Ranger was the horse he had always pictured in his mind, and of the mares, 3 of them are fillies from our last stallion. Papa always kept the best females from every line. 2 of them are mixed with Mustangs, so they have good, strong bones. And the 2 that are pregnant are carrying the first of Ranger's foals. If those babies are born strong, they will be the proof of what Papa was trying to build." Caleb was quiet for a second, taking it all in. "When are they due?" "Late December or early January. Right in the dead of winter, of course." "That's always how it goes, isn't it?" He shook his head. "We will have to make sure that barn is sealed up good and tight. The last thing we need is a newborn foal getting sick." The easy way he said "we" sent a little shiver of hope through Eliza. This was real. This was really happening. "What about your cattle?" she asked. "You said you have a herd up in Colorado." 300 head, a mix of breeds, mostly Herefords, with some Longhorns mixed in for toughness. Right now, they are with an outfit I used to work for. The foreman is keeping them for me. I already paid him for their winter grazing before I left. When spring comes, I can either sell them off and bring the money here, or we can drive them down to New Mexico if we have enough pasture for them. The Arroyo pasture could probably handle about 100 head, Eliza said, thinking out loud. Maybe more if we move them around right, but not 300. Not all at once, no. We would sell what we do not need. We would keep a small group to breed from, build it up slow. The main thing is not to let them eat the grass down to nothing. That is how you kill the land for good. They rode in silence again for a bit, but it was a good silence this time. That talk had put them on equal footing. They were both bringing something to the table, both ready to work to make this happen. Then the town of Socorro started to appear on the dusty horizon like a dream. It was a small collection of adobe and wood buildings, all gathered around a main square, with a church steeple sticking up in the middle of it all. Even this early, the streets were getting busy, with shopkeepers setting out their goods and ranchers coming into town. Town was already humming with morning chores, folks carting supplies and kids scurrying to the schoolhouse. As they rode the wagon down the main street, Eliza could feel every single pair of eyes on them. She knew exactly what they were all thinking. There goes a young woman with a man who is not her kin, and they look mighty comfortable together. By lunchtime, the story would be all over the county. Well, let them wag their tongues. Caleb paid the gawkers no mind at all, his gaze fixed on finding the office of the town lawyer. They found it tucked away on a quiet street by the courthouse, a modest building with a shingle that read Arthur Peaton, attorney at law. "I sure hope he is no relation to the man from the bank," Eliza whispered. "The spelling is different," Caleb noted, gesturing with his chin. "Besides, when it comes to the law, a man's coin usually speaks louder than his bloodline." After securing the wagon, they stepped inside. The office was small but orderly, with walls full of law books and a desk drowning in paperwork. A man in his 50s glanced up, his eyeglasses sitting on the end of his nose. "Can I help you folks? We are here to get partnership papers made," Caleb stated plainly. "We need them legal and solid for a ranching business." Mr. Peaton's eyebrows climbed a little. "I see. And your names are?" "Caleb Mercer, and this here is Miss Eliza Hartley. She is the owner of the Hartley place, northeast of town." "Ah, yes, the Hartley Ranch. I know it well." "Thomas Hartley was your father, was he not?" the lawyer asked, looking at Eliza. "He was," she confirmed. "A good man. I was real sorry to hear he had passed on." Mr. Peaton pointed toward the chairs before his desk. "Please have a seat. So you want to form a partnership for your ranch. What kind of terms were you considering?" For the next hour, they worked through all the particulars. A 50-50 split of ownership, shared authority for decisions based on what they each knew best, and clear rules for dividing profits, settling disagreements, and even ending the partnership if it came to that. Mr. Piton posed sharp questions, ensuring they both fully grasped what they were getting into. "Now, Miss Hartley," he said after a while, "you realize that by signing on to this, you are effectively handing Mr. Mercer half the rights to a property your family has held for 30 years. I do. And you are settled in your mind about this?" Eliza looked the lawyer straight in the eye. "Mr. Mercer paid off my entire debt just yesterday, right when the bank was about to take everything. Without his help, I would have nothing left. With him, I have a real chance to keep my family's legacy alive and make it thrive. Yes, I am settled." Mr. Piton then faced Caleb. "And you, sir, are sinking a good deal of money into a ranch you have never worked, with a partner you hardly know. Does that seem like a smart move to you?" "It does," Caleb answered without hesitation. "I looked into the value of the land. I went over the breeding books Miss Hartley showed me, and I walked the property myself. The bones of the place are good. All it was missing was money to operate and another set of hands, both of which I can supply." The lawyer looked from one to the other for a long moment, then gave a slight shrug. "Well, it is your lives to lead. I will get the papers ready. It will take me a couple of days to have it all written up right and proper. Until then, I suggest you both give this a lot of thought. A partnership can be a blessing or a curse, and what makes the difference is usually how well the partners talk to one another." "We will be fine," Eliza said, with more certainty than she truly felt. They left the office, having agreed with a handshake to come back in 3 days and sign the official papers. As they headed for the wagon, Caleb spoke up. "We ought to stop by the general store. If we are going to get this ranch on its feet, we are going to need some things." "I do not have much money on me," Eliza confessed. "I do," he replied. "Just think of it as our first partnership expense." At the store, they once again became the center of attention. Mrs. Henderson, the owner's wife, looked as if she was about to burst with questions, but she just put on a show of being overly polite. "Miss Hartley, it is so good to see you out and about." "And Mr. Mercer," Caleb acknowledged with a nod. "Ma'am." They bought what they needed for the ranch to get by. Wire for fences, nails, oil for the lamps, coffee, flour, salt, bacon, and beans. Caleb also picked out a brand new axe and a strong coil of rope. On an impulse, Eliza added a bolt of cloth for new winter curtains, a strangely homey feeling washing over her. While they were loading their goods into the wagon, a voice chirped, "Eliza Hartley, is that really you?" Eliza turned and saw Margaret Sullivan walking toward them, a woman her age she had known all her life. Margaret's eyes were practically sparkling with curiosity. "Maggie," Eliza said, managing a tight smile. "It is good to see you. You too. I heard the most unbelievable rumor just yesterday. Something about the bank fixing to take your ranch." "They tried," Eliza answered, her voice steady. "But the debt is all paid now. Oh, thank goodness. But how in the world did you—" Margaret's gaze drifted over to Caleb, who was standing by the wagon. "Oh, I see." Eliza could almost hear the gears turning in her head. "Maggie, this is Caleb Mercer. He is my new business partner. We are going to be running the ranch together. Business partner." The way Margaret said the words made it sound like a scandalous secret. "My, how modern of you." "It is a proper legal partnership," Eliza said, her tone growing colder. "We are having papers drawn up by a lawyer. Of course, of course. I am certain everything is completely above board." Margaret gave a little smile that said she believed no such thing. "Well, I really must run. Mother is waiting for me at the dressmaker's. But we must have tea soon, Eliza. I'm just dying to hear every little detail about your new arrangement." She turned and hurried away, her head already swiveling to see who else she could tell. "Well," Caleb said with a dry tone, "that went just about how I figured it would." "It will be like this for a bit," Eliza sighed, her face flushing with heat. "People are going to talk. They're going to make things up." "Let them," Caleb said, climbing onto the wagon seat. "We know what is true, and that is the only thing that counts. Besides, as soon as they see us working hard and running a serious operation, they will find some other business to stick their noses in." Eliza wanted to believe he was right, but she had her doubts. Folks in a small town never forgot, and they surely did love a good scandal. They started the journey back to the ranch, the wagon groaning with the weight of their new supplies. About halfway home, Caleb broke the silence. "I have been thinking on our living situation." A knot formed in Eliza's stomach. "The barn is all right for now," he went on, "but it will not be very warm come winter, and if this partnership is going to last, I will need a real place to stay. I was thinking we could build an addition onto the house. It could have its own door and its own stove for heat. It would cost a little, but it would be a smart use of our money." "That sounds practical," Eliza said, relieved he was being so businesslike about it. "Or," Caleb added, "if you would feel better with more distance between us, I could build a little cabin for myself down near the barn. It would take more time, but we would both have more of our own space." "The addition is the better idea," Eliza decided. "The house is sturdy, and we would not have to buy as many materials. And with two of us working the ranch, it would be good to have someone nearby if there was ever an emergency." "Good point. I will get started on it next week, right after we sign those papers." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but Eliza's mind was racing. She was about to share her home, not just her land, but the very roof over her head with a man she hardly knew. It was a sensible, necessary decision, and it was also something that would cause a whole new round of talk. Her mother would have been horrified, but her father, she thought, her father just might have understood. Once they got back to the ranch, the rest of the afternoon was spent hauling supplies and figuring out which fix-up jobs could not wait. Caleb had a way of spotting trouble Eliza had either plumb missed or just did not have the know-how to handle. "That whole fence line is fixin' to fall over," he said, motioning with his chin toward the east pasture. "The posts are rotten clean through. I reckon we will need to swap out 20 of them at least." "I know," Eliza confessed. "I just never had the time or the materials." "Well, we have got 'em both now. I will get started on that tomorrow." They put in a hard afternoon's work, with Caleb giving the buildings and gear a good once-over while Eliza saw to the horses. She caught herself watching him when she figured he was not looking. She noticed the steady way he moved, how he paid mind to the little things, and the quiet respect he had for her father's craftsmanship, even when he found a flaw. As the sun started to dip low, it hit Eliza that she had not had a bite to eat since breakfast. "I ought to start on some supper," she announced. "Are you hungry? I mean, you are welcome to eat with me, seeing as we are partners now." Caleb looked up from a gate hinge he was studying. "I would appreciate that, ma'am, but I can surely cook my own meal if you would rather be alone." "Oh, that is nonsense. It does not make a lick of sense for both of us to be cooking separate meals." She took a breath. "I should tell you, though, I am a better hand with horses than I am with a skillet." "I have been eating trail grub for 12 years, Caleb said, a small smile touching his lips. "I can guarantee your cooking is a step up." Dinner was plain and simple. They had salt pork fried up with potatoes, a side of beans, and coffee that was strong enough to peel paint. They ate at the kitchen table, the very same one where her family had shared 1,000 meals. Eliza tried hard not to think how peculiar it felt to see someone new sitting there in her father's chair. "This is mighty good," Caleb said, and he sounded like he truly meant it. "You are just being polite." "No, ma'am, I'm being honest. You ought to try my cooking sometime. Then you would know the difference." A comfortable talk started up about the plans for the next day, what work needed doing first, and the smartest way to split up the chores. It was all businesslike and sensible, which somehow felt a whole lot easier than trying to talk about anything personal. After supper, Caleb stood up and started gathering the dishes, even though Eliza told him not to. "If we are partners, we share the work," he stated plainly. "All of it." "Even the woman's work?" Eliza asked, with a little bit of a challenge in her voice. "Ma'am, especially that. I have been taking care of my own cooking and cleaning for more than 10 years. I do not see any reason why it ought to become somebody else's problem just because a woman is nearby." Eliza found herself warming to him more in that one moment than she had since he first rode up. As true dark settled in, Caleb picked up his bedroll from his horse and started for the barn. "There are extra blankets in the house," Eliza called out to him. "If you need them." "I will be just fine. Sleep well, Miss Hartley." "Eliza," she said before she could think twice. "If we're going to be partners, you ought to call me Eliza." He paused and turned back, just a shadow against the last bit of daylight. "Then you had best call me Caleb. No need for all that formal stuff between partners. Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Eliza." She stood and watched him vanish into the barn before heading inside and sliding the bolt on the door, a new habit she picked up after yesterday's close call with the bank. The house felt more vacant than it usually did, but at the same time, it felt more alive. For the first time in ages, the air held the promise of a new day, instead of just the same old fear. The next 3 days fell into a routine that felt both new and completely natural. They worked from the moment the sun came up until it went down. Caleb took on the fence repairs, while Eliza looked after the horses and handled all the little jobs that keep a ranch from falling apart. They took their meals together, talking over plans and problems, and slowly they started to figure out how the other one worked. Eliza soon learned that Caleb was a deliberate and patient man. He was the kind of fella who did a job right the first time, even if it took a bit longer. He was not much of a talker while he worked, but when he did have something to say, it was always thought out and helpful. He also had a dry sense of humor that would sneak up on her, making her laugh with a quiet comment when she was least expecting it. For his part, Caleb seemed to truly value that Eliza knew her business and did not need him looking over her shoulder. One time she caught him watching her as she worked with the horses. He had a look on his face that looked an awful lot like respect as she calmed a nervous mare using nothing more than a soft voice and a whole lot of patience. On the third day, they rode into town to make the partnership official. Attorney Piton had all the documents ready. There were 2 copies of a detailed partnership agreement that spelled out every last particular of their deal. Eliza read it over 2 times, her heart thumping against her ribs as the weight of it all settled in. This was real. This was the moment she was no longer the only owner of her father's ranch, but one half of something brand new. "Any questions before you sign?" Mr. Piton asked. Eliza looked over at Caleb. He met her gaze without flinching, his face perfectly calm. "No questions," she said. They both signed their names. Piton added his as the witness. The partnership was a done deal. Walking out of that office was like stepping into a whole new life. The same sun was shining down on the same dusty street, but everything felt different. "How are you feeling?" Caleb asked as they got back on the wagon. "Scared to death," Eliza admitted, "but also relieved and hopeful, all of it at once." "That sounds about right to me," Caleb nodded. "I would be worried if you were not at least a little bit scared. It means you understand what we're getting ourselves into." As they rode out of town, Eliza spotted Vernon Hastings standing in front of the bank, watching them with a look she couldn't quite figure out. She just lifted her chin and stared right back at him. He had tried to ruin her, to take everything she had. Now she was driving away with a partner and a real future. She hoped he choked on the dust. Back at the ranch, they treated themselves to a dinner that was a little nicer than usual. Eliza had splurged on a chicken from town, and she roasted it with some wild herbs she had picked from the hills. It felt almost like a celebration, though neither of them said it out loud. After they ate, Caleb laid a rough drawing on the table. "I've been thinking about adding a room," he said. "If we build it off the east side of the house, we can use the wall that's already there for support and connect it to the main roof line. It won't be anything fancy, but it'll be solid and warm." Eliza looked over the sketch. "When would you start?" "Tomorrow, if the weather holds. I can work on it in the evenings after I'm done fixing the fences." "That's a whole lot of work." "Work is what I'm here for." Over the next 2 weeks, the ranch started to look like a different place. The fence line stood tall with new posts, all straight and strong. The roof on the barn got patched up, the old well pump was fixed. And slowly, one board at a time, Caleb built himself a room on the side of the house. Eliza helped out when she could, holding boards steady while he hammered, bringing him tools or mixing mortar for the little stove he put in. She saw that he worked with the same quiet skill he brought to everything else, never rushing, but never wasting a single motion. They settled into a daily life that felt both close and careful. Caleb always got up first, put the coffee on, and took care of his horse before Eliza even came downstairs. She'd make breakfast while he figured out the day's chores. They'd talk over their plans with their coffee, then go their separate ways to get things done, meeting back up at noon for a quick bite and to see how things were going. The busybodies in town finally got tired of talking when nothing juicy ever happened. A few folks even started to treat their partnership like a real business deal. Other ranchers would stop by to look at the horses. The merchants in town started dealing with Caleb like a proper partner, instead of some stranger just passing through. One afternoon in early November, a tough old cattleman named Jack Morrison rode up, saying he wanted to look at some horses. He had known Eliza's father, and had always been an honest man in his dealings. "Heard you took on a partner," Morrison said to Eliza. "The folks in town sure had a lot to say about that." "I imagine they did," Eliza said, her voice steady. Morrison looked over at Caleb, who was making a corral fence stronger nearby. "Is that him?" "That's Caleb Mercer. Would you like to meet him?" "I already have, about 6 years back. He was working a cattle drive up through Colorado. He's a good man from what I remember. An honest fellow to do business with." Morrison gave a nod of approval. "You could have done a lot worse." That was the closest thing to a blessing Eliza had gotten from anyone in town, and it meant more to her than she ever would have guessed. As November wore on and the days got shorter, the ranch started to feel less like a heavy burden Eliza was carrying all by herself, and more like a real working operation. You could see the pregnant mares were showing now, their bellies getting round with the promise of new life. Caleb had the new room just about finished, and the two of them had built a partnership based on respect for each other and a companionship that felt surprisingly easy. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun go down behind the hills, Caleb said, "I need to head to Colorado." Eliza felt her stomach drop. "When?" "Soon, before the real winter hits. I've got to settle things with the cattle company, decide what to do about the herd, and bring back some bulls if we're going to start our own breeding program here." "How long will you be gone?" 3 weeks, maybe a month. It all depends on the weather and how many head of cattle I decide to drive back." "A whole month. The idea of running the ranch all by herself again, even just for a little while, filled Eliza with a feeling that was close to panic. She had gotten used to having his help, to being part of a team. The thought of going back to struggling alone, even for a short time, was scarier than she expected. "The mares," she said. "They're due in December. What if something goes wrong?" "I'll be back long before then," Caleb promised her. "I'm thinking about leaving in a couple of days. That way I'll be back by the middle of December at the latest. That leaves us plenty of time before the foals start arriving." "What if you get held up? What if a blizzard comes through, or—" "Eliza," Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not walking out on this partnership. I'm going to take care of business we need to handle so we can move forward. You ran this ranch all by yourself for months before I ever showed up. You can surely handle a few weeks now." "That was different. I didn't have any other choice back then. And you don't have one now. This trip has to happen." He paused for a moment. "Unless you don't trust me to come back." Eliza looked at him, a little stung by his words. "That's not it. I trust you. I just—" She had a hard time putting the fear into words. "I'm not used to depending on somebody. And now that I am, the thought of being alone again feels even harder than it did before." "That's what a partnership is," Caleb said quietly. "It makes you stronger when you're together, but it also means you feel it more when you're apart. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It just means it's important." He was right, and Eliza knew it. She gave a reluctant nod. "I'll need you to handle the fence work while I'm gone," Caleb went on, switching to practical things. "And there's a part of the barn roof that needs patching before the snow starts to fly. I'll leave you detailed notes about everything." "Detailed notes? You think I can't remember what you tell me?" "I think you'll have enough on your plate without trying to remember if I said to brace the northwest or the northeast corner." They spent the next 2 days in a rush of getting ready. Caleb finished the new room, a simple but sturdy space with a narrow bed, a stove, a chair, and some pegs on the wall for hanging his clothes. He moved his few belongings in, and all of a sudden the house felt different, more lived in, more like a home that was shared instead of just a space somebody was borrowing. He wrote out pages of notes for her on how to keep the ranch running, organized all the tools so everything was easy to find, and made Eliza practice some of the repairs she might have to do while he was away. She put up with all his fussing because she knew it was coming from a place of concern, not because he thought she couldn't handle it. The evening before he left, they had a quiet dinner. Eliza had made a thick stew with lots of vegetables and meat, the kind of meal that would stick to a man's ribs on a long journey. "I'll send a message when I get to Colorado," Caleb said. "And I'll send another one before I start heading back. If you need anything, if there's an emergency, you can send a wire to the cattle company. They'll get the message to me." "I'll be fine," Eliza said, with more confidence than she really felt. "I know you will, but it's all right to ask for help if you need it. That's what a partnership means, knowing you don't have to do it all by yourself." After dinner, Caleb went to check on his horse one last time, making sure the gelding was all set for the long ride ahead. Eliza stood on the porch, wrapped up in a shawl to fight off the November chill, and watched him work. He moved around the barn with the kind of easy comfort of someone who had already made the place his own. Just 2 months ago, he was a complete stranger. Now he was her partner, and she was trusting him with half of everything she owned. And more than that, she was trusting him to come back. When he came back to the house, his saddlebags were packed and ready for the morning. Eliza was still standing on the porch. "You ought to get some sleep," he said. "I'll be gone before the sun's up." "I wanted to say—" Eliza stopped, trying to find the right words. "Thank you for everything. For helping with the debt, for the partnership, for building a room instead of just staying in the barn, for treating this place like it matters." "It does matter," Caleb said simply. "This ranch, this partnership, it's the foundation of everything I've been working for. Of course it matters." "Still," she said, "thank you." He nodded and tipped the brim of his hat in that way she'd come to know as his own kind of goodbye. and then he headed to his new room. Eliza went inside to her own bed, but it took a long time for sleep to find her. She laid there awake, listening to the little sounds of the house settling, the wind whispering through the eaves, and somewhere on the other side of her wall, the quiet stirrings of someone else in the space that had been hers and hers alone for so long. Tomorrow Caleb would be gone, and she would be alone again, running the ranch, waiting for him to return, and hoping that her trust in him wasn't a mistake. But for tonight, right in this moment, she wasn't alone. And that, she was starting to learn, made all the difference in the world. The sound of hoofbeats fading away in the dark before dawn was the loneliest sound Eliza had ever heard. She stood on the porch, her coffee cup growing cold in her hands, and she watched until even the dust Caleb's horse kicked up had settled back down to the earth. And then she was alone, with 3 weeks of work ahead of her, 2 pregnant mares to watch over, and a little doubt creeping in that maybe she had trusted too fast, that maybe she had believed too easily in a stranger who promised her a partnership, but who might just disappear into Colorado and never come back. She shook the thought right out of her head. Caleb had signed the papers. Legal papers. He had added a whole room onto her house. He had put his own money down right alongside hers. A man did not do things like that if he was planning to just ride off into the sunset. Even so, the ranch felt a whole lot bigger and emptier than it ever did before he showed up, as if his being there had taken up more room than she had known. Eliza buried herself in the work. The fence line that Caleb had made a start on needed to be finished. The barn roof he had pointed out had to be patched up before the winter storms rolled in. The horses needed their daily care, and the pregnant mares needed extra watching as they got heavier and more uncomfortable each day. There was firewood that needed splitting, water that needed hauling, and 1,000 other little repairs that had been put off because she never had the time or the strength. After just the first day on her own, Eliza's hands were raw with blisters, and her back was one solid ache. She fixed a simple supper of beans and cornbread and ate it standing by the stove. Sitting down at that big empty table just felt too lonesome. She fell into bed so worn out she did not even have the energy to worry. The second day blew in a cold wind from the north, the kind that hinted at snow, even with the sky staying clear and blue. Eliza got to work on the barn roof, gripping a hammer and nails in her half-frozen fingers, trying to recall everything Caleb had shown her about laying the shingles just right. She was about halfway done when she noticed one of the pregnant mares was acting strangely. Eliza scrambled down that ladder so fast she almost took a tumble, her heart hammering in her chest. The mare, a bay she called Sage, was kicking at the dirt and walking in tight circles. Her sides were dark with sweat, and that was not right in this cold. "Easy now, girl," Eliza soothed, coming up on her slow. "Take it easy." But Sage's eyes were rolling back, and she was pulling in air in rough, loud breaths. This was all wrong. The foal was not due for another 6 weeks at least. If she was going into labor this early, Eliza knew some things, but not everything. Her knowledge was solid, but it was not complete. Her father had always taken the lead on the difficult births, with Eliza helping him out. She had seen trouble before, and knew the warning signs, but she had never had to handle a premature birth all by herself. She guided Sage into a clean stall, lined thick with fresh straw, and checked her over from head to tail. The mare's water had not broken, but Eliza could see the contractions, her whole body going tight with each one. This was too soon. It was all happening way too soon. "Come on, Sage," Eliza whispered, stroking the mare's damp neck. "You just hold on, please. Just hold on." For 3 long hours, Eliza stayed right there with that horse, watching every single contraction, listening to every change in her breathing, ready to step in if the birth really started. She prayed every prayer she ever learned, and then made up a few new ones on the spot. At last, by some miracle, the contractions started to come further apart, getting weaker instead of stronger. Sage's ragged breathing began to even out. The danger, whatever had brought it on, was finally passing. By the time Eliza dragged herself back to the house, the clock had ticked well past midnight. She fell onto her bed without even taking off her work clothes, too bone-tired to think about being clean or comfortable. The next morning, Sage looked to be doing better, but Eliza kept a close eye on her all day long. There were no more contractions, no more signs of trouble. Whatever it was, the mare had pulled through, but the whole thing had shaken Eliza to her core. What if the contractions had kept coming? What if the foal had arrived early and needed special help to survive? What if it had been a breech birth, or there had been bleeding, or any of the dozen other things that could go terribly wrong? She would have been out here all alone, making choices between life and death with nobody to ask for help, with no second set of hands. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with all of Caleb's detailed notes spread out before her. And for the very first time since he had gone, she finally let the tears come. It was not really sadness, but the crushing weight of all the responsibility, the pure exhaustion of facing everything by herself, and the terror of making a mistake that could cost her an animal, or even worse. She cried for her father, who had always made the hard work seem so simple. She cried for her mother, who had never once complained about the lonely and difficult life. And she cried for herself, for trying to be strong enough to hold up a legacy that felt far too heavy for just one person. Crying did not fix a single thing, but it did help to wash some of the strain away. She splashed her face with cool water, brewed some coffee, and got back to her chores. A week after Caleb left, a telegram came from Colorado. The boy from the telegraph office brought it out himself, clearly hoping to pick up some fresh gossip, but he left disappointed after Eliza read it with a straight face and sent him on his way. The note was short. Arrived safe, herd healthy, weather good. Will write. CM. Eliza read it over 3 times. She was relieved to know he had reached Colorado safely, but frustrated by how little those few words told her. Will write. But when? And what would he say? The letter he promised showed up 5 days later. It was longer than the telegram, but still had his usual straightforward tone. Caleb wrote that he had found the herd to be in fine shape. He was talking with the foreman of the outfit about which cows to sell and which to drive back home. The weather had gotten colder, but was still clear. He figured he would start the trip back within the week. How are the mares, he had written at the end. Are they showing any signs of foaling soon? Keep Sage calm and make sure she eats well. Watch her legs for any swelling. That could be a sign of trouble. And do not you dare try to finish that barn roof by yourself if a storm rolls in. It can wait for me. You are worth more than a few shingles. That last sentence made Eliza's throat feel tight. She carefully folded the letter and tucked it away into her father's desk, and then stepped outside to look at Sage, who sure enough had some swelling in her hind legs. Eliza used the rest of the day digging through her father's old veterinary books, mixing up poultices, and wrapping the mare's legs with careful bandages. By morning, the swelling had eased. The days just bled into one another after that. A long stretch of work, worry, a few small wins, and a few bigger losses. The air got a colder bite to it. The first snow came, just a light dusting that the afternoon sun melted away. But it was a clear promise of bigger storms on the horizon. Eliza got the fence line mended, patched up the barn roof as best she could, and did everything possible to get the ranch ready for winter's grip. She also started to realize just how much Caleb had been handling that she never even noticed. The firewood didn't just split itself. The water buckets didn't haul themselves up from the well. The tools didn't get cleaned and put away on their own. All those little upkeep chores that somehow got done when 2 people shared the load were now piling high, needing time she just didn't have. By the 3rd week, Eliza was running on pure grit and black coffee. She had lost weight she couldn't stand to lose, and the dark circles under her eyes looked like they were permanent. But the ranch was holding on. The horses were in good shape, and she had proven to herself that she could, in fact, run this place alone if she had to. She just really, with all her heart, hoped she wouldn't have to. On the 22nd day since Caleb left, Eliza was in the barn doctoring a small cut on one of the geldings when she heard hoofbeats and the low, rumbling sound of cattle. Her heart gave a jump. She dropped the tin of medicine and hurried outside. 3 riders were coming up the road, pushing a small herd of about 30 head of cattle in front of them, all of them moving at the slow, weary pace of creatures that had come a long way. And leading the pack, sitting up straight in his saddle despite being plumb tuckered out, was Caleb Mercer. Eliza felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly made her knees buckle. She grabbed the barn door frame to hold herself steady, just watching as the riders skillfully guided the cattle into the Oyo pasture. Caleb swung down from his horse, spoke a few words to the other 2 men, and then started walking toward the house. His eyes found her right away, and even from that distance she saw the weariness on his face change to concern. He closed the space between them with long, quick strides. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "No, I am fine. I just—" Eliza realized she was trembling. "I am fine. You are back. 3 days early." "We made better time than I figured." Caleb's eyes were searching her face, taking in the lost weight, the exhaustion, and all the signs of someone who had been running on empty for far too long. "Have you been eating?" "Yes, mostly. When I remember to." "Eliza, the mares are fine," she said in a rush, knowing that would be his next question. "Sage had some early contractions about 2 weeks ago, but they passed. I have been watching her like a hawk. She had some swelling in her legs, but I doctored it, and it is almost all gone. Everything is fine." Caleb looked like he wanted to argue that point, but one of the other riders called out to him. "Mercer, we got the cattle settled in. You need us to stick around and help with anything else?" "No, Tom, you and Davis go on and head into town. Get yourselves a hot meal and a proper bed. I will square up with you in the morning." The 2 men tipped their hats and rode off, looking too tired to think about anything but sleep. Caleb turned back to Eliza. "Come on, you need to sit down before you fall over." "I am not going to fall over." "Just humor me," he said. He guided her toward the house with a steady hand on her elbow, and Eliza was too worn out to put up a fight. Inside, he sat her down at the kitchen table and right away started building up the fire in the stove. "When was the last time you ate a real meal?" he asked. "I eat real meals." "That is not an answer, Eliza." She tried to think back to yesterday. "I believe I had some eggs yesterday morning." Caleb muttered something low under his breath that she was sure was not very flattering. He dug around in the pantry, pulling out food, and in just a few minutes he had bacon sizzling in a skillet. The smell made Eliza's stomach rumble so loud that Caleb shot her a look that plainly said, "I told you so." While the food was cooking, he poured her a cup of coffee, real coffee, strong and hot, and stood there watching her with his arms crossed, like he was worried she might just vanish if he looked away. "I told you to take care of yourself," he said. "I did take care of myself. I just also had to take care of everything else around here." "You look like you have not had a good night's sleep in a week." "I sleep," Eliza insisted, "just not for very long at a time." Caleb just shook his head and turned his attention back to the stove. He loaded a plate high with bacon, eggs, and fried potatoes, placed it in front of her, and said one word: "Eat." Eliza wanted to argue just for the sake of it, but the food smelled too wonderful and her hunger was too deep. She ate while Caleb cooked another batch for himself. For a good while the kitchen was quiet, filled only with the sounds of them eating and the warm crackle of the fire. At last Caleb said, "Tell me what happened with Sage." Eliza told him everything about the scare with the early contractions, the long hours she spent watching over the mare, and the swelling that had shown up and that she had treated. Caleb listened to the whole story without a single interruption, but his face grew more and more worried with every word she spoke. "You should have sent me a wire," he said when she was finished. "And said what? Come back home because I'm scared? You were doing important work. I handled it." "Being partners means we handle things together, Eliza. That includes the scary things. You were not here, so I handled it by myself. That is what people do." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "I should not have left you alone for 3 weeks. That was a bad call on my part. You had to go, we both knew it. I should have planned better." Hired a hand to help you while I was gone, at least. We cannot afford to hire help yet. We can afford that a whole lot better than we can afford you working yourself into an early grave trying to do it all." He pushed his clean plate away. "From now on, if I have to be gone for more than a couple of days, we make sure you have help, and that is not up for debate." Eliza wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was catching up to her now that the rush of his return was starting to wear off. "Fine. Did you bring back the bulls?" "3 of them. Young, with good bloodlines and different enough genetics that we can start a healthy breeding program. They are in the Oyo pasture with the herd." He stopped for a second. "I also brought back some of my own stock. I had to sell off the rest to that outfit, but I kept my best breeding cows. I figure we can build the herd up from there." "How many head in total?" 32 cows and 3 bulls. It is not a huge operation, but it is a start." Eliza did some quick math in her head. With good management, they could likely double that herd in 2 years and have a truly profitable cattle operation in 5. When you added that to the horse breeding, the ranch could actually start to prosper instead of just scraping by. "That is good," she said. "That is really good." Caleb was watching her again with that same worried look. "When was the last time you got a full night of sleep?" "Define full." "More than 4 hours." Eliza considered lying, but she did not see the point. "I do not remember." "Right. You are going to bed. Right now. It is not even dark yet. And you are dead on your feet. Go to sleep. I will take care of the evening chores. You just drove a herd of cattle all the way from Colorado. And you have been running this whole ranch by yourself for 3 weeks straight. I am tired. You're exhausted. There is a big difference." When Eliza still did not get up, he added in a softer voice, "Please, just let me handle things for one night. You have more than earned it." The kindness in his voice was what finally broke her. Eliza nodded, too tired to argue anymore, and went on upstairs. Her plan was to change into a nightgown, wash her face, and do all the things a person normally does before bed. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed to pull off her boots, and woke up 10 hours later, still in her clothes, with a blanket draped over her that she knew she had not put there. Sunlight was pouring in through her window. Eliza sat up, feeling a bit lost, and realized that Caleb must have come in at some point in the night to cover her up. The idea should have felt like an intrusion, but instead it just felt like he was caring for her. She got properly changed, washed up, and went downstairs. She found breakfast was already cooking and Caleb was gone, likely out taking care of the animals. There was a note on the table in his square handwriting. "Stay inside. Rest. We will handle all the chores today. This is not a request." Eliza could not help but smile. She ignored the note, of course, and went outside to help. But she moved at a much slower, more sensible pace than she had in weeks. And when Caleb sent her an exasperated look from across the barn, she just shrugged her shoulders. "Partners share the work. Remember? You said it yourself." "I meant when you are not half dead from being so tired." "I am not half dead. I am only about a quarter dead. That is completely different." "You are an impossible woman." "Well, you are the one who decided to be my partner." Something in Caleb's expression softened then. "Yeah," he said. "That I did." They worked their way through the morning, falling right back into the easy rhythm they had before he left. It was strange how fast things fell back into place. That silent teamwork, the way they just knew who should do what, the simple comfort of working alongside someone. By that afternoon, Eliza felt more like her old self. They headed out to the oil pasture to look over the new cattle, and she had to give it to Caleb. He had a good eye. The animals were strong and healthy, with the solid frames they'd need to survive out here. "They'll earn their keep," she said, which from her was high praise, and he knew it. "The bulls can service the mares and the cows both if we need 'em to," Caleb mentioned. "Though I figure you'll want Ranger handling most of that." I sure will, but it is always good to have options. They stood there for a spell, just watching the herd graze. The winter sun was low and weak, and the wind was cold, but it didn't bite too hard. It was one of those quiet, perfect moments you get on a ranch, when everything is peaceful and right where it belongs. Then Caleb said, "I've got something to tell you." A knot formed in Eliza's stomach. This was it, the bad news he'd been holding back. "What is it?" she asked. "Well, while I was up in Colorado, I had a lot of time to think about this partnership, this whole arrangement, and how it's all been going." He paused, looking like he was picking his words with great care. "This is working, Eliza. Honestly, it is working better than I ever expected. You are a good partner. You are fair, you are capable, and you carry more than your share of the load. Maybe too much, judging by the last 3 weeks. Is there a but coming? No, no but. I am just saying that I am in this for the long haul. No matter what happens, no matter how tough it gets, I am committed to making this partnership work. I just wanted you to know that." The wave of relief that washed over Eliza was stronger than she could have imagined. She had been steeling herself for him to say he was having second thoughts, that 3 weeks on his own had made him realize this had all just been a big mistake. But instead, he was doubling down on his promise. "I am committed too," she said. "Even when you drive me plumb crazy, insisting on doing everything the proper way instead of just getting it done. And even when you work yourself into the ground trying to prove you do not need any help." They started walking back to the house, their boots rustling through the grass that was already turning brown for the winter. Eliza caught herself thinking how much her life had changed in just 3 months. The foreclosure notice, the mountain of debt, that crushing feeling of trying to save her father's ranch all alone. It felt like it had all happened to someone else in another lifetime. That evening they sat down for a real dinner together at the kitchen table. Caleb must have been starved for decent food on his trip, because he had truly made an effort. He cooked up steaks from the cattle he brought back, roasted some potatoes with wild onions, and even baked a pie from dried apples. It felt like a celebration. "Well, aren't we getting fancy?" Eliza remarked. "3 weeks of trail food will make a man appreciate a real kitchen." "I thought you said my cooking was good." "It is. But you do not make pie." "Fair point," she conceded. After dinner, they sat out on the porch, bundled up in their coats against the cold, and watched the stars pop out in the dark sky. Caleb had made coffee, and the warmth of the mug felt good in Eliza's hands. "The mares," Caleb said after a bit. "How close do you reckon they are?" "Sage could go any day now. She has dropped. You can see how her belly's changed shape. The other one, Willow, probably has another week or two. We should set up a watch schedule. Make sure someone is checking on them every few hours through the night. I was planning on sleeping out in the barn once Sage gets real close. Then we both will. We can take shifts. That way we both get some rest. But the horses are never left alone." The easy way he said "we" still sent a little jolt of warmth through Eliza. She had been on her own for so long that having someone else just naturally include himself in her plans felt like a precious gift she never even knew she needed. "Caleb," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Thank you for coming back, for bringing the cattle, for—" She waved a hand, not sure how to say it all. "For everything." He looked over at her, his eyes looking serious in the faint starlight. "You do not need to thank me for keeping my word, Eliza. That is just common decency. Still, a lot of men would not have. Then you have been knowing the wrong kind of men." Maybe she had. Or maybe she just had not ever had the chance to know someone like Caleb Mercer. A man who said what he meant and did what he said. A man who saw a partnership as something sacred, not just convenient, who looked at her like an equal instead of some woman who needed to be managed. That night, Eliza slept better than she had in months, a deep and dreamless sleep in her own bed, knowing that Caleb was just downstairs in his room doing the same. The house felt whole again, in a way it had not since her parents passed. It was not because a man was living there. It was because the house was no longer a place built for being lonely. The next morning, the first real snow of the season began to fall. Big, heavy flakes came down thick and fast, blanketing the whole ranch in white. Caleb and Eliza worked together, making sure all the animals were under shelter with extra feed, that the water troughs would not freeze solid, and that the firewood was stacked up close to the house. By the middle of the morning, the snow was coming down so hard you could barely make out the barn from the kitchen window. "This is going to be a bad one," Caleb said, looking out. "Good thing you made it back when you did. One more day and you would have been caught right in it. One more day and I would have been worried sick thinking about you stuck out here alone in it." They spent the rest of the day inside doing indoor chores. They mended tack, organized supplies, and went over the ranch's account books together. Caleb showed Eliza all the records from the cattle sale, walking her through how he had negotiated the prices and what he had spent on supplies for the long ride back. "You are better with numbers than I would have guessed," Eliza commented. "A trail boss has to be. You are managing payroll, supply costs, road expenses, and the final sale prices. You either get good at math or you go broke." Eliza then showed him her breeding records, the detailed notes her father had started years ago that she had kept up. Caleb asked smart questions about bloodlines and how traits were passed down, showing he knew a lot more about selective breeding than he had let on. They worked well together, Eliza realized. They had different strengths and different areas of knowledge, but they shared the same values and the same drive to work hard. It was a solid foundation to build a partnership on. That night, the storm was still howling outside. They ate dinner by the warm glow of a lamp as snow piled up against the windows and the wind moaned around the corners of the house. After they cleaned up, they sat by the fire. Caleb took the old, worn armchair that used to be her father's. Eliza sat on the sofa, with a blanket draped over her lap. "Tell me about your family," Eliza said quietly. "You mentioned your mother's farm. What happened to it?" Caleb was quiet for such a long time that she thought maybe he was not going to answer. Finally, he spoke. "My father died when I was 16. A horse kicked him in the head. Just a freak accident. My mother tried to keep the farm going, but she did not know the business side of things. My father had always handled all of that. Within a year, she was behind on debts she never even knew they had. The bank foreclosed. We lost everything. I'm so sorry. She passed away 2 years later. I think she just gave up. She could not stand living in town after she lost the land. I was 18 years old, on my own with nothing but what I could carry, and a fire inside me to never be that powerless again. So you started saving every single dollar for 12 years. I figured if I ever got another chance at a piece of land, I would make damn sure nobody could ever take it away from me." He looked right at her. "That is why I could not just watch it happen to you. I could not stand by and let the bank take everything when I had the money to stop it." Now Eliza understood him so much better. The careful saving, the deep commitment to their partnership, that fierce way he protected what they were building together. He was not just putting his money into some land. He was trying to rewrite the ending to his mother's story. "We are not going to lose this ranch," she said, her voice firm. "Not either one of us. We are going to build it into something that will last." "I believe that," Caleb said. "I really do." The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, in that moment, everything felt safe and secure. 3 days later, the storm finally blew itself out, leaving the ranch buried under a good 2 feet of snow. They dug their way out, checked on all the animals, and were relieved to find that everything had made it through. The pregnant mares were getting restless, but they were healthy. Caleb set up the watch schedule he had talked about. They took turns checking on Sage every 3 hours, day and night, watching for any sign that her labor was starting. Eliza taught him what to look for, the constant pacing, the pawing at the ground, the way a mare's belly would clench up with contractions. On the fifth night after his return, Sage finally went into labor. Eliza was on watch, making her midnight rounds, when she found the mare in clear distress. She ran to wake Caleb, and they hurried back to the barn to monitor the birth together. It was a difficult one. The foal was turned the wrong way. One of its legs was folded back instead of both being stretched out forward. In that position, it could not be born safely. "I have to reach in there and try to reposition it," Eliza said, her voice strained with fear. "If I cannot turn it, we will lose them both." "Just tell me what to do," Caleb said, his voice steady and calm. "What can I do to help?" His calm voice cut through her panic and centered her. Right then, they were a team. Eliza reached a careful hand into the birth canal, trying to guide the foal's leg forward. At the same time, Caleb held Sage's head, speaking soft, soothing words to keep the mare from giving up. It took 20 long, hard minutes. Eliza's arm was buried deep inside the laboring horse, her fingers searching for the tiny hoof that was in the wrong spot. At last, she felt it move into place. "I got it," she said, out of breath. "Both legs are forward now. She should be able to push." And Sage did. With a mighty effort, a wet, long-legged foal slid out onto the straw. It was a little filly, perfect and whole, already trying to lift her head. Eliza sank back on her heels, shaking with a mix of relief and pure exhaustion. Caleb was still by Sage's head, grinning like a fool. "We did it," he said. "We sure did," Eliza agreed. They stayed there in the barn until the little foal was up on her feet and nursing, a clear sign she was healthy, despite the tough start. Sage licked her baby clean, her pride showing in every stroke, already a protective mama. As they walked back to the house in the cold air before dawn, Eliza realized her hands were still trembling. Caleb must have noticed because he put his arm around her shoulders. It was just for a second, a quiet moment of comfort between two partners who had just been through something intense. "You were amazing back there," he told her. "I was scared to death." She looked at him. Being scared and doing it anyway, that is what amazing looks like. Inside, Caleb put on a pot of coffee while Eliza washed up. They sat together at the kitchen table, too wound up to even think about sleep, no matter how early it was. "I could not have done that by myself," Eliza admitted. "If you had not been here, if you were still off in Colorado, I do not know if I could have stayed calm enough to fix that foal." "But I was here," Caleb said simply. "That is what being partners is all about. When things get hard, when they get scary, you are not in it alone." "For so long, I thought I had to handle everything by myself," Eliza said in a low voice. "I thought asking for help made me weak, and depending on anybody else was just asking for trouble. But now, I think I am starting to see the difference between depending on someone and being partners with them. The difference between being weak and being wise." She looked right at him. "You taught me that, whether you meant to or not." Something in Caleb's face changed. It was a warmth, maybe, or him seeing the trust she was putting in him. "You have taught me a few things, too," he said. "About sticking with a dream. About not quitting when the work gets tough. About what it means to love something so much you would break your own heart trying to save it." They sat there in the quiet kitchen as the first light of dawn started to break outside. Just two people who had been strangers 4 months ago, now tied together by a piece of paper, a herd of cattle, and a perfect newborn filly sleeping soundly in the barn. Eliza knew with a sudden certainty that this partnership was the best choice she had ever made, not just for the ranch, but for her. Whatever was coming next, and she had a feeling plenty was coming, both good and bad, they would face it together. And that, she realized, made all the difference in the world. They named the filly Starlight, on account of the white marking that ran down her face like a streak of moonlight. She got stronger every day in those first weeks, and Eliza would spend hours just watching her explore the world on those impossibly long legs. But the happiness over the new life was clouded by worry for Willow, the second pregnant mare. She was getting bigger, but she was not showing any of the usual signs that labor was getting close. "She should have dropped by now," Eliza said one morning in the middle of December, running a hand over Willow's stretched-out belly. The mare was not comfortable, always shifting her weight, but nothing was moving forward like it was supposed to. Caleb frowned, watching the horse with a careful eye. "How far overdue is she?" "Almost 2 weeks, maybe a little more. The breeding dates were not exact." Eliza's voice was stretched thin with worry. "I have never had a mare go this long. Something is wrong." They started checking on Willow every 2 hours, day and night. Caleb took the night shifts without a word of complaint because he knew Eliza was already worn out with worry. Winter had come in hard, dumping snow faster than they could shovel it away. The daily chore of keeping the ranch going in that bitter cold left them both bone-tired. 3 days before Christmas, Caleb came back to the house at dawn, his face grim. "She is down," he said, "and she cannot get up." Eliza's heart felt like it dropped to the floor. She grabbed her coat and ran for the barn with Caleb right on her heels. Willow was lying in her stall, her sides heaving and her eyes rolling with distress. When Eliza tried to get her to stand, the mare barely even moved. "How long has she been like this?" Eliza asked, already checking the horse over. "I found her this way 20 minutes ago. She was on her feet at the midnight check." Eliza's hands moved across Willow's belly, feeling for the foal's position, trying to find any sign that labor was starting. What she felt made her blood run cold. The foal was turned all wrong. It was not just a leg out of place, it was completely sideways. There was no way for it to be born naturally. "We need a veterinarian," she said, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. "Now!" "The nearest vet is in Socorro. That is 3 hours away in good weather, and we have got 2 feet of fresh snow on the ground." "Then go. Ride hard. I will stay with her." Caleb did not waste a second arguing. He saddled his horse and rode out into the dark early morning. Eliza stayed with Willow, doing everything she knew to make the mare comfortable, just trying to buy some time until help could get there. But time was the one thing they did not have. 2 hours went by. Willow started to go downhill fast. Her breathing got rough and heavy. Her body temperature began to drop. And no matter what Eliza tried, the mare was slipping away. Eliza had delivered foals in trouble before. She had helped her father with emergencies, but this was more than she could handle. The foal was too big, turned too badly, and Willow was just too weak to make it through the kind of operation that might save the baby. Eliza sat down in the straw next to the dying mare, with tears running down her cheeks, and made the hardest decision of her entire life. She could not save them both. The foal was probably already gone, trapped in a way that had likely cut off its air hours ago. But Willow, if Eliza acted right now, if she stopped trying to save the foal and put everything into keeping the mare alive, there was a chance. With shaking hands, she did what had to be done. The work was awful and heartbreaking. By the time it was over, Eliza was covered in blood and sobbing. But Willow was breathing easier, the terrible weight finally gone from her body. The foal, a perfectly formed colt, had been gone for hours. Caleb got back with the veterinarian to find Eliza sitting against the stall wall. The dead foal was wrapped in canvas beside her, and Willow was standing on wobbly legs. But she was alive. Dr. Harrison took one look at the scene and knew right away what had happened. He checked Willow from head to tail, gave her medicine to stop any infection, and then he turned to Eliza. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "The foal was already lost. You saved the mare's life." "I know," Eliza whispered. "That does not make it any easier." After the vet left, Caleb buried the little colt in the frozen ground while Eliza stayed with Willow. It took him 3 hours of back-breaking work, the shovel fighting against the hard earth. But he did it because it had to be done, and because Eliza needed to know the foal was laid to rest the right way. When he came back into the barn, she was still there, just sitting in the straw and staring off at nothing. "Come on inside," Caleb said softly. "You are frozen solid." I should have known something was wrong sooner. I should have called the vet days ago. You did everything you possibly could. Sometimes everything is not enough. My father never lost a foal. Not in 30 years of breeding this stock. Your father had 30 years of experience. You have got 3. And you made a choice that saved Willow's life. That is what matters. Eliza let him help her get to her feet and lead her back to the house. She felt numb just going through the motions of washing up and putting on clean clothes without really thinking about it. When she came downstairs, Caleb had soup warming on the stove and a pot of strong coffee brewed. "Eat," he said, and the way he said it left no room for argument. She ate because he told her to, though she did not taste a thing. Her mind kept playing back every moment of the last week, trying to figure out what she missed, what she could have done differently. "Stop it," Caleb said, watching her face. "Stop what? Blaming yourself. I can see it happening. You're going back over every decision, every choice, looking for where you went wrong. Do not do that. How can I not? That foal died because sometimes things just go wrong," he cut in. "Because nature is not always kind and it is not always fair. Because sometimes, even when you do everything right, you can still lose." He leaned forward, his eyes serious. "You want to know what I see? I see someone who fought for 3 hours in a freezing barn to save what she could. Someone who had to make an impossible choice and had the strength to see it through. That is not failure, Eliza. That is courage." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to accept that she had done her best in a situation with no good outcome. But all she could see was that tiny, perfect colt, gone before it ever took a single breath. That night she cried until she fell asleep, with the winter wind just howling outside the old house. Sometime in the deepest dark, she woke up and saw Caleb sitting in the chair next to her bed. He was just keeping watch, the same way he did the night Sage had such a hard time giving birth. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Making sure you are okay. I am fine." "No, you are not, but you will be." He took a breath. "On my first cattle drive, we lost a good 100 head of cattle trying to cross a river. They stampeded in the water, and the animals were drowning. There was nothing we could do to stop it. I felt like I had failed, like I was to blame for every single one. The trail boss, he told me something I never did forget. He said you can do everything right and still lose. It does not mean you failed. It just means you are dealing with living things in a world you cannot predict." "Did it help you? Him telling you that?" "Not at first, but it did later on." Caleb got to his feet. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow is a whole new day of work." She finally did sleep, and when she woke up the next morning, the sadness was still there. But it was not a crushing weight anymore. She could breathe around it. Christmas came and went without much fuss. They worked all day just like any other, but Caleb did surprise her with a little gift. It was a leather journal to keep track of breeding records, much better quality than the old notebook she was using. "For writing everything down," he said. "The good and the bad, both. That way you can learn a little something from all of it." "I did not get you a thing," Eliza said, feeling her face get warm. "You gave me a partnership in a piece of land worth building a future on. That is more than enough gift for me." They ate a better supper than they usually did. Caleb roasted a chicken and Eliza baked some biscuits that, for once, turned out just right. It was a simple meal, but it felt important. It was their first holiday spent together. A small sign of how much had changed since that awful day in October when the bank was about to take it all. The winter got deeper. They fell into a new kind of rhythm. The cattle business needed their attention all the time, breaking up ice in the water troughs, hauling feed through the snow, and checking on the animals in that bone-deep cold. The horses had to be cared for every day, and Starlight, as she grew, needed a little extra looking after. Between the two of them, Caleb and Eliza got it done. But some days the work felt like it would never end, and the cold felt like it was trying to break them. One especially mean morning in January, when it was so cold that water turned to ice just minutes after you poured it, Caleb came inside from his chores. His face was pale from the chill, and his hands were shaking so bad he could not hold his coffee mug steady. "That is enough," Eliza said, her voice firm. "We are hiring some help. At least one ranch hand to see us through the rest of this winter. We can manage. We can barely manage. And it is wearing us both down to the bone. We need help, Caleb. That is not a sign of weakness. That is just being smart. He stared at her for a long second, and then he gave a slow nod. You are right. I will go into town and ask around, see if anyone is looking for work to get through the winter. 2 days after that, a young fella named Jesse Colton rode up to the ranch. He was 19 years old, thin as a rail, with eager eyes and calloused hands that told you he was no stranger to hard work. I heard you might be needing a hand, he said, standing there in the yard holding his hat. I am good with both cattle and horses. The cold does not bother me none. I work hard. I do not complain, and I am honest. Eliza looked over at Caleb, who was sizing up the young man with the sharp eye of someone who had hired his share of trail hands over the years. You have any references? Caleb asked. I worked over at the Morrison Ranch this past summer. Jack Morrison will speak for me. Well, that was all they needed to hear. Morrison was known for running his place well and had no time for fools. $1 a day plus your room and board, Caleb said. You will have a bunk in the barn and take your meals here with us at the house. You will be expected to work whatever hours we need you, and in the winter, that means most of them. Yes, sir, and you will take orders from either of us, no different. This here is a partnership. What Miss Hartley says carries the same weight as what I say. Jessie looked at Eliza with a whole new kind of respect. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Having Jessie around made all the difference in the world. The daily chores started to feel possible again. The three of them were able to take turns with the duties, which made sure that nothing was missed and nobody worked themselves to pure exhaustion. Jesse turned out to be just what he said he was. He was hard-working, dependable, and he had a real knack with the animals. But more than that, his being there changed things between Eliza and Caleb in ways that neither of them had seen coming. With a third person around, even if it was just during the workday, they started to notice their own closeness more. They noticed the way they had begun to finish what the other was about to say, and the small, easy touches that had grown between them. Caleb would put his hand on her shoulder as he walked behind her chair. Or Eliza would straighten his scarf before he headed out into the biting wind. One evening, late in January, after Jessie had gone to the barn for the night, Eliza and Caleb were sitting by the fire just as they had gotten used to doing. The quiet between them was a comfortable one, but it was filled with something that neither of them had put a name to yet. Can I ask you something? Eliza finally said. Anything. Do you ever think about what is next? Not just for the ranch, but for everything else. Caleb put down the piece of harness he had been mending. I think about it all the time. And what is it you see? He was quiet for a good long while. To be honest, I see this partnership turning into something more. I see us building not just a ranch that does well, but a life here together. I see. He stopped, like he was thinking over his next words. What? Eliza pushed, her heart starting to beat a little faster. I see myself asking you to marry me, Caleb said, his voice low. Not because it makes sense for the ranch or because it is what folks would expect, but because somewhere between this past October and right now, I went and fell in love with you. Those words just hung there in the quiet air between them, feeling brave and fragile and like they had come out of nowhere. Eliza felt like she could not breathe. Caleb, you do not have to give me an answer right now, or ever, if that is not what you want. I am not trying to make our partnership different or mess things up. I just had to let you know, because I am not very good at hiding how I feel, and I do not want to go through the rest of this winter pretending that I do not love you, because I do. Eliza just stared at him, her thoughts all jumbled up. She should have realized this was happening. She should have seen what was growing between them. But she had been so caught up in the ranch and just trying to survive, in proving that she could hold up her end of this partnership, that she had completely missed the most important thing of all. She was in love with him, too. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. It had happened somewhere between him paying off her debt and building a new room on her house and staying up through the night with a horse in labor and making sure she ate when she was too busy to remember. Somewhere in all of that, she had fallen completely and totally in love with Caleb Mercer. "I need some time," she heard herself say, "to think on this, about what it would all mean." "You take all the time you need," Caleb said, but she could see the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "Nothing has to change. We are partners first. That is what matters." But everything had already changed. The words were out there now, and Eliza could not take them back. She could not go back to thinking of Caleb as just her business partner when her heart pounded in her chest every time he so much as looked at her. She went to bed that night with her mind in a spin, turning over all the possibilities and all the fears. A marriage would mean tying herself to someone for good, trusting another person with not just her ranch, but with her entire life. It meant being vulnerable in ways a partnership never asked for. It meant admitting she needed someone, not just for practical things, but for reasons of the heart. The very idea of it scared her to death, but it also filled her with a kind of hope she had not let herself feel since her folks had passed away. It was the hope of building something that would last, of not having to face what was coming all by herself, of loving someone and being loved right back. 3 days later, trouble struck in a way that none of them could have ever seen coming. Caleb was out working in the Aoyo pasture checking on the cattle when his horse got spooked by something. Maybe it was a snake, or maybe just a shadow moving fast. The gelding reared up, and Caleb, caught by surprise, was thrown hard to the ground. He landed all wrong, with his leg twisted up under him, and the awful sound of a bone snapping echoed across the quiet pasture. Jesse found him 20 minutes later. He was only half conscious and pale with pain, his leg bent at an angle that made the young man's stomach lurch. "Get Eliza," Caleb managed to say through clenched teeth. "Do not try to move me. Just go get her." Jessie took off for the house, and Eliza came running with her medical kit in her hand. One single look at Caleb's leg told her everything she had to know. The break was bad. It was a compound fracture with the bone sticking out through the torn skin. It was the kind of injury that could leave a man crippled for life if it was not treated right. "We need the doctor," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Jesse, you ride for Socorro as fast as that horse can carry you. You tell Dr. Harrison that it is an emergency." "That will take hours," Jesse argued. "In this cold, with an injury like that, we do not have time to stand here and argue about it. Go." Jesse went, and Eliza was left there all alone with Caleb, who was drifting in and out of consciousness from the shock and the pain. "Do not you dare die on me," she told him with a fire in her voice as she worked to brace the leg the best she could with what she had. "Splints. You hear me, Caleb Mercer? You are not allowed to tell me you love me and then pass away 3 days later. That is not how this is going to work." Through a fog of pain, Caleb mustered a look that might have passed for a smile. "I was not planning on dying." "Good, because I have some things to tell you, and you are going to be awake and clear-headed when you hear them." With Jesse's help when he returned, she managed the nightmare of getting him back to the house and settled into his bed. Dr. Harrison showed up 4 hours later, looked over the leg, and gave her the news Eliza was bracing for. "This is a real bad break. I can set the bone, but there is no promise it will heal right. In the best-case scenario, he is facing months of just trying to get back on his feet." In the worst case, the doctor trailed off. He did not need to finish. Eliza stood out in the hall by Caleb's room while Dr. Harrison did his work. Hearing the pained sounds, Caleb could not hold back, even with the laudanum the doctor gave him. She had been through a lot in her 23 years, losing her parents, the foreclosure, making impossible choices, and facing death. But this was something else entirely. This was watching the man she loved hurt, and knowing she could not do a thing to stop it. When Dr. Harrison finally came out, his face was grim. "The leg is set. I did all I could. The rest is up to him and to you. He is going to need you around the clock for the next few weeks. That bone has to mend perfectly straight, which means he has to stay put, even when everything in him will be screaming to move. The wound needs a daily cleaning so it does not get infected. And he needs to keep his strength up, which is not going to be simple when he is in so much pain. I can handle all of that, Eliza said. It is not going to be easy. You are already running this whole ranch, and now you have to play nurse on top of it all. I do not care if it is easy. Just show me what needs to be done. The doctor left her with detailed instructions and enough laudanum to get for the next 7 days. After the doctor rode off into the growing dark, Eliza just stood there in the yard and let herself tremble for 1 whole minute. Then she pulled her shoulders back and marched right back inside. Caleb was awake, his face pale and slick with sweat, his leg locked tight in the splints the doctor had put on him. He spoke, his voice thin. "Eliza, do not talk. You need your strength. I have to tell you about the cattle. Jesse cannot handle them by himself, and Willow needs to be. I will take care of it. All of it. Jesse and I have got the ranch. You just worry about getting well. Being partners means when one of us stumbles with the load, the other one picks it up. That is me right now. So you are going to lay there and mend and not think about a single thing but getting stronger." Caleb tried to protest, but the pain and pure exhaustion took him under before he could even get the words out. Those next few weeks were the toughest Eliza had ever known. She and Jesse split all the ranch chores, taking on Caleb's work on top of their own. Their days began before the sun came up and ended long after it had set. In between all that, Eliza tended to Caleb. She cleaned his wound, changed the dressings, and made him eat when the pain stole his hunger. She kept him still when his body screamed to move. She only slept in short bursts, mostly in the chair next to his bed, snapping awake at any noise that might mean he needed her. Jesse really stepped up, working more hours than he was paid for and never once complaining, even when the work felt downright impossible. Caleb was a horrible patient. He fought against being still, got mad at his own weakness, and hated depending on anyone when he was used to being the rock for others. "I ought to be out there," he said one afternoon. He tried to sit up and his face went white as a sheet from the pain. "You ought to be healing," Eliza said back, gently pushing him back down on the pillow. "The ranch is fine. Jesse is doing a fine job. Everything is under control. You are worn slap out. I can see it on your face. I have been worn out before. I will be just fine." "This is not what I wanted," Caleb said, his voice full of bitter disappointment. "You having to nurse me like I am helpless while all the work of the ranch falls on you. What you want does not matter right now. What you need is what matters." Eliza sat on the side of the bed, being careful not to bump his leg. "Caleb, do you remember what you said to me after I lost the foal? You said that sometimes, even when you do everything right, it is just not enough. That does not make it a failure. It just means you are dealing with wild things in a wild world. That is different. It is exactly the same. You were thrown from your horse. It was not your fault. It was not something you could have stopped. Now you are doing everything right, listening to the doctor, resting, healing. That is all you can do." He shut his eyes. "I am supposed to be your partner, an equal. Right now, I am nothing but a weight on you. You are not a weight. You are someone I—" She stopped, the words getting stuck in her throat. Caleb's eyes opened and locked with hers. "Someone you— What?" Eliza took a deep breath. This was not at all how she had pictured this conversation going. She always thought there would be a perfect time, maybe somewhere romantic, a chance to choose her words just so. But life does not hand you perfect moments. It gives you this. A man she loved, lying hurt in a bed. Both of them bone-tired. The ranch just barely holding on all around them. And maybe that was perfect in its own way. Because this was real life. And real love happens right in the middle of trouble, not when everything is easy. "Someone I love," Eliza said softly. "You asked me 3 days before the accident if I would ever think about marrying you. I did not give you an answer because I was scared. Scared of needing somebody. Scared of relying on anyone else. Scared of what would happen if I gave you my whole heart and you dropped it." "Eliza, just let me finish. I have spent these last weeks watching you hurt and fight, and I have realized I am already in. I already need you. I already count on you, and I already love you so much the idea of losing you makes it hard to catch my breath. Being scared of getting hurt does not change a single thing. It just means I am wasting precious time that we could be using to build a life together. Tears were rolling down her cheeks now, but she did not even care. So, yes, she went on. Yes, I will marry you, if you are still asking. If you still want me after all these weeks of me being so bossy and a terrible nurse. Caleb reached up with his good hand and pulled her down for a kiss. It was clumsy and perfect, and it tasted of tears and hope, and the feeling of finally being home. Yes, the offer is still open, he said when they finally pulled apart. And I still want you. I will always want you, even though I'm a terrible cook. Eliza laughed through her tears. We might have to hire someone for that one day. Caleb kissed her again. And somewhere in that kiss, all the fear and the exhaustion and the worry just melted away. It left behind something much simpler and much more true. It was a love chosen on purpose, built on partnership and respect. It was the kind of trust that can only grow when you have been through the hard times together. They were married quietly in March with Jesse and Dr. Harrison as their witnesses, right there in the parlor of the ranch house. Caleb was still on crutches. His leg was getting better, but it was not yet strong enough to walk on without help. Eliza wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had altered so it would fit her. The ceremony was short, and the celebration was simple. But when Caleb slid that plain gold ring onto her finger, Eliza felt like she was the richest woman in the whole territory. Partners, Caleb whispered, saying the same word they had spoken when they first signed a business agreement a few months back. Partners, Eliza had said, and she meant every word. That night, she lay beside her husband in the room that had been just hers for so long. Eliza thought about how much had changed since that desperate day in October. Back then, she was so sure she had to do everything on her own. She believed that asking for help was a weakness, and that depending on anybody would only lead to heartache. Lord, how wrong she had been. The ranch was truly theirs now, signed and sealed. The cattle business was growing bigger by the day. The horses were flourishing, and Starlight was turning into the exact horse her daddy had always dreamed of raising. And somewhere in the middle of all that success, she had found something so much more precious. She had found a partner who saw her as his equal. He loved her not in spite of her strength, but for it. He had proved to her over and over that some folks were worth trusting with your whole heart. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, his voice thick with sleep. "That I'm happy," Eliza said, plain and simple. "For the first time since my folks passed, I am truly and completely happy." Caleb gently pulled her closer, mindful of his healing leg. "Good, because this is just the start of things." And as she lay there in the quiet dark, listening to her husband's steady breath, Eliza believed him. It was the beginning of something that was built to last. Spring busted loose with a beauty so wild it made the hard winter feel like a bad dream. The hills went from brown to green almost overnight. Wildflowers painted the land in colors so bright they almost hurt your eyes. The cattle got fat on the fresh grass, and the horses galloped through the pastures, just plain joyful to be free from their winter stalls. Caleb's leg was mending, slow but sure. By April, he was off the crutches and using a cane. By May, he had even set that aside, though he walked with a slight limp that Dr. Harrison said might just stick with him. Sometimes Eliza would find him standing by the fence, just looking out over their land, his hand rubbing that leg that had nearly cost him everything. "Does it ache?" she asked him one evening, coming up to stand beside him. "Sometimes. Mostly it just reminds me how downright lucky I am." He turned to her and his face was serious. "I could have lost that leg, could have died from the infection. Instead, I'm standing right here with my wife, watching our cattle graze on our land. It is hard to complain about a limp when what could have been was so much worse. Their land, their cattle, their life together." Those words still sent a little shiver of pride through Eliza. Jesse had stayed on with them through the winter and into the spring. and he had turned out to be worth his weight in gold. He had grown from a skinny 19-year-old kid into a capable ranch hand who had his own ideas about managing cattle and was not afraid to share them respectfully. Caleb had started teaching him the finer points of choosing breeding stock, and Eliza had him helping out with the horses. Then one afternoon in late May, Jesse came to them holding his hat in his hands. He had a look on his face that said he had some tough news to deliver. "What is on your mind, son?" Caleb asked. "I got an offer," Jesse said. "Jack Morrison wants me to come work for him. It is a permanent position, could lead to foreman. It is good money and a real chance to learn the business from the top down." A knot formed in Eliza's stomach. They had come to rely on Jesse. More than that, she had grown mighty fond of the boy. Losing him meant they would have to scramble to find somebody new or go back to trying to manage everything by themselves. But Caleb surprised her. "That is a fine opportunity," he said. "Morrison runs a good, solid outfit. You would learn a whole lot over there." "I would hate to leave y'all in a bind, though," Jesse said, his eyes darting between them. "You have both been real good to me. Taught me so much. It just feels wrong to walk away." "It is not wrong to take a better chance when it comes along," Eliza said, even though the words were hard to get out. "When would he want you to start?" "Morrison wants me there in 2 weeks. But if y'all need more time to find a replacement, 2 weeks is all we need," Caleb said, his voice firm. "We will figure it out. And Jesse, you earned this. Do not you feel one bit guilty about moving on up?" After Jesse had gone, Eliza turned to her husband. "We cannot manage all this alone. Not with the bigger herd and all the horses." "I know," he said, "but we cannot hold that boy back just because we need him. That would not be fair to him. So, what are we going to do?" Caleb stood there for a minute, just thinking. "We hire 2 people. Not one man trying to do it all, but 2 specialists. We need someone who knows cattle from the inside out, and someone who has real expertise with horses. It is time to build a proper crew instead of expecting one person to do the work of 3. It made perfect sense, but it would mean a bigger payroll. Still, the ranch was making good money now. The horse sales had been strong all winter, and the cattle business was really starting to show its promise. They could afford to bring on some good, skilled help. Over the next week, they sent word all over the territory that they were hiring. The response they got was a surprise. It seemed the Hartley-Mercer Ranch was getting a reputation as a good place to work. Folks said they were fair bosses who paid a decent wage and treated their help with respect. They interviewed 5 different men for the cattle job and ended up hiring a weathered old cowboy named Tom Briggs. He had worked on ranches from Texas all the way to Montana and knew breeding stock the way some folks know the Bible. For the horse position, they came face to face with an applicant they never expected. Sarah Reeves was 42 years old, lean as a whip with calloused hands and eyes that sized up a horse with the same sharp look Eliza's father used to have. She had been the stable master for a rich family back in Kentucky before she decided to head west. She knew about bloodlines and training methods that Eliza had only ever read about in books. "I am going to be honest with you," Sarah said as she sat across from them in the ranch house. "Most men will not hire a woman for this kind of work. They figure I cannot handle it, or that I will just cause trouble. But I am the best horse trainer you are going to find in this whole territory. I do not care too much about the pay, as long as it is fair, and I get to work with some quality animals." Eliza looked over at Caleb. She saw the question in his eyes, and she gave him a small nod. "You are hired," Caleb said. "You will get the same wages as Briggs, a room in the new bunkhouse we are building, and a share in any horse you personally train that sells above a certain price." Sarah's eyes got wide. "A share?" "We believe in rewarding good work," Eliza explained. "My father always said the best way to make folks care about quality is to give them a personal stake in how things turn out. You make our horses better, you get a piece of the profit. Seems fair to us." "More than fair," Sarah said, her voice a little choked up with emotion. "When do I start?" They all settled into a new routine with the larger crew. Tom took charge of the cattle, starting new grazing rotations and breeding plans that improved the herd's quality right away. Within just a few months, Sarah was working miracles with the horses. She took the solid foundation Eliza had built and added her own techniques, producing some truly magnificent animals. Buyers were traveling from 3 territories away just to see them. And through it all, Caleb and Eliza were learning how to be business partners and husband and wife at the same time. It was not always easy. They had disagreements about money, about what to prioritize, about whose knowledge should lead a certain decision. But they had made a habit early on of talking through their problems instead of letting them simmer. They always remembered they were on the same team, even when they did not see eye to eye on the strategy. Then in July, Eliza found out she was pregnant. She had suspected it for a couple of weeks, but had kept it to herself, wanting to be sure before she got anyone's hopes up. When Dr. Harrison confirmed it, she just sat in the wagon on the ride home trying to sort out her feelings. She was excited, of course, but she was also absolutely terrified. Her own mother had died of a broken heart, but she had also gone through 3 miscarriages between the time Eliza was born and her father's death. Being pregnant was dangerous, and giving birth was even more so. Caleb was out mending a fence when she got back to the ranch. She walked out to where he was working, her heart just hammering in her chest. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked up right away, his face full of concern. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. At least I do not think so. I am pregnant." Caleb dropped his hammer. For a second he just stared at her, his face impossible to read. Then he was moving, closing the space between them and pulling her into his arms with a tenderness that brought a lump to her throat. "Are you happy about it?" he asked, his voice soft against her hair. "I do not know," Eliza confessed. "I am scared. My mother—" "You are not your mother. And you are strong, Eliza. You are stronger than anyone I have ever known. Women die in childbirth, strong women, healthy women. But many more live through it just fine and have healthy babies." He pulled back so he could look her in the eyes. "We will get the best care. Dr. Harrison will watch over everything, and I will be with you every single step of the way. You cannot be with me during the birth. That is not how it is done. Then I will be right outside the door, close enough to hear you cussing my name for getting you into this mess." In spite of all her fear, Eliza laughed. "I might just do that anyway." The pregnancy went along just fine through the summer and into the fall. Eliza kept right on working for as long as she possibly could. Papers. By October, exactly 1 year since Caleb first rode onto her ranch, she was too big and awkward to do much more than light chores and telling other people what to do. One afternoon, she and Caleb sat on the porch watching the sun go down over a piece of land that had completely changed in 12 months. The cattle were grazing peacefully way out in the pasture. The horses were running around in fields with brand new fences. The ranch house had been added onto again, this time to make real bedrooms for the growing family they were making. "Do you remember this day last year?" Eliza asked him. "I remember every single second. You were standing right here on this porch watching those bankers take account of your whole life. The look on your face when I paid off your debt, like you could not decide if I was a fool or if you were having a dream." "I thought you were a fool," Eliza admitted. "Paying $2,300 for someone you had never even talked to. Best money I ever spent in my life. You did not know that at the time. I knew enough." He took her hand and wove his fingers through hers. "I knew you were the kind of person who would fight for what mattered. That was something worth betting on." Vernon Hastings had stopped by the ranch once in the early summer. He said it was to check on the property's value for the bank's records. But Eliza figured he was really there to see if they had gone bust yet. Instead, he found a place that was doing great with healthy animals, good workers, and new improvements that had made the land worth a lot more. "You have done well," he had said, and he could not quite cover up how disappointed he sounded. "We have done well," Eliza had corrected him, putting extra stress on the first word. "My husband and I." She got a special kind of joy from watching him ride away, knowing he would have to go tell his bosses that the Hartley Mercer Ranch was not just getting by, but it was actually making money. A small, mean part of her hoped that news stung him a little. In December, as the first anniversary of the new year approached, Eliza went into labor. It was late in the afternoon, with the winter sun already dipping down low, when the first pains started. Caleb sent Tom riding like his life depended on it to go get Dr. Harrison. He had Sarah come stay with Eliza while he paced around the house like a trapped animal. The labor was a long one, almost 20 hours, but it was not difficult. Dr. Harrison watched over everything with great care. Sarah stayed right by Eliza's side, giving her the kind of practical, no-nonsense support that was somehow more helpful than empty words of comfort would have been. When the baby finally made his appearance, screaming and perfect, Dr. Harrison put the little one in Eliza's arms and said, "You have a son, and from the sound of those lungs, he is healthy as a horse." Caleb was allowed to come in then, and the look on his face when he saw his son for the very first time was something Eliza knew she would never forget. It was wonder and fear and a powerful love all mixed together. "He is perfect," Caleb whispered. He touched one of the baby's tiny hands with a finger that looked huge next to it. "We did good work," Eliza said, tired but thrilled. "You did the hard part. We will just call it even." They named him Samuel, after Caleb's father. Samuel Mercer, born December 20th, 1887, on a ranch that had almost been lost but had instead become the start of something that would last. The months after Samuel was born were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, and learning a lot very quickly. Eliza thought she understood hard work, but taking care of a baby while she was still healing from giving birth challenged her in ways she had never imagined. Caleb was as much a part of it as a man could be back then. He walked the floors with a fussy baby at 3 o'clock in the morning. He changed diapers without a single complaint and took over the night feedings when Eliza was too worn out to even function. Sarah turned out to be a surprising amount of help, having raised her own younger brothers and sisters back model, Kentucky. She showed Eliza all the little secrets for calming a crying baby and handling the crazy balancing act of being a mother and running a ranch. By the time spring rolled around, they had settled into a comfortable routine. Samuel was mostly sleeping all the way through the night. Eliza was able to get back to her ranch duties at least part of the time, and things were running so well they could even sneak a day off now and then without the whole place going to pieces. One afternoon in May, Caleb walked into the house and found Eliza rocking Samuel to sleep in the old chair her father had built for her mother. "I have got some news," he said. "Is it good or bad?" "Good. Real good. I just sold 3 yearlings to a fellow out in California. He is starting up a breeding operation and wants our horses to be his foundation." "What did he pay?" Eliza asked, although she could already tell by the look on Caleb's face. "Enough to settle up the last of what we owe for the expansion and still put a good chunk away. We are completely out of the red, Eliza. We do not owe a dime, have a healthy savings, and the orders are coming in quicker than we can even fill them." She knew things were going well, but hearing him say it like that made it all feel solid and true in a new way. They had actually pulled it off, taking a ranch that was on its last leg and making it a success in less than 2 years. "My father would be proud," she said, her voice soft. "He would be in awe of you. You took what he dreamed of and made it bigger and better than he ever could have." "We did it together," Eliza corrected him. "I could not have done a single bit of this without you." Caleb sat down in the chair across from her. "Do you remember when you were so afraid to rely on anybody? You thought it was a sign of weakness. I was being foolish. You were just scared. There is a big difference." He waited a moment. "But just look at what we made because you were brave enough to trust. Not just the ranch, which is something to see, but this," he said, looking around, "them. We built a family, a home, a whole life that neither one of us could have made by ourselves." He was absolutely right. Every good thing that had come into Eliza's life was born from that one scary choice to accept help, to become a partner, and to trust another person with her hopes and her future. In June, Sarah came to them with news of her own. She and Tom Briggs had been seeing each other, a fact that everyone on the ranch knew, but was polite enough to ignore, and now they were planning to get married. "I would understand if you had to let one of us go," Sarah told them. "Having couples on the ranch can sometimes make things complicated." "Why on earth would we let either of you go?" Caleb asked, looking truly confused. "You are both the best at what you do. Whatever happens on your own time is your own affair. They had their wedding in July, a simple little affair right there on the ranch. And Caleb and Eliza gave them the new cabin as a wedding present. Having two married couples in charge of the ranch shifted things again, but all for the better. Tom and Sarah gave the place a kind of steadiness and commitment that you just could not get from single ranch hands. The years that came after were filled with the usual mix of victories and hardships that come with ranch life. They had good years when cattle prices were up and the horses found buyers fast, and they had lean years when a dry spell or a bad market tested their grit. They lost animals to sickness and accidents. They celebrated new births, and they mourned their losses. Samuel went from being a baby to a toddler, and then to a little boy who trailed his father all over the ranch like a little shadow, already picking up the work that would someday be his. When he was 3, Eliza had a daughter they named Grace, because of the amazing grace that had seen them all through. Grace was nothing like Samuel. Where he was quiet and careful, she was a little spitfire, climbing things she should not, and riding horses before she could even properly walk. She reminded Eliza of her own mother, bless her heart. She had that same fire, a spirit that just wouldn't be fenced in. It had been a whole decade since that October day Caleb rode in and saved her ranch. And sometimes Eliza had to just stop and shake her head, wondering how her life had turned so completely around. The Hartley-Mercer Ranch was known clear across 3 counties as the place to get a good, honest cow horse, one with grit and smarts. Their cattle business, while not the biggest, was turning a fine profit and growing every year. They'd even bought up the neighboring land when it went up for sale, giving their stock more room to graze. They built a proper bunkhouse for the seasonal hands, a whole separate barn for their breeding stock, and a little schoolhouse for the children that served other ranch families nearby. But more than all that brick and timber, Eliza cherished the life they'd built inside it. Samuel, 10 years old now, was already showing his daddy's steady hand and his mama's way with horses. Little Grace, only 7, could outride boys twice her size, and had ideas about raising cattle that sometimes made Tom just laugh out loud. One evening, late in October of 1896, Eliza and Caleb were sitting on the porch just like they had hundreds of times. The children were tucked in bed, and the whole ranch was quiet, save for the night sounds of animals settling in and the wind whispering through the tall grass. 10 years, Eliza said, her voice soft. Almost to the day, Caleb answered. October 15th was the day the bank was set to take it all. I can hardly recall being that scared woman standing right here watching those bankers take stock of my life. I remember her. She was something else. Scared, yeah, but not broken. Not by a long shot. That's what told me. Told you what? That you were worth saving. That this ranch was worth saving. That putting everything I had on a stranger was the smartest bet I'd ever make. Eliza leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, feeling a comfort she never thought she'd find with another soul. You ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't come along that day? Sometimes. You'd have lost the ranch, likely ended up working some job in town, maybe married someone safe and dull. And you would have kept looking for your own piece of land. You'd have found it, I reckon, but it wouldn't have been this place. It wouldn't have been with me. We got lucky, Eliza whispered. We got brave, Caleb corrected her gently. Lucky is when something good just falls in your lap. Brave is when you risk it all for something that matters. We both did that. You by taking me on as a partner, and me by offering. The rest of it, that all came from good old-fashioned hard work. He was right, like he usually was. Maybe luck brought him to her gate that particular day. But everything that came after was built on choice and promise and a stubborn will to see it through. The door creaked open and Samuel shuffled out, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Mama, I had a dream about Grandfather, the one who built this place. Eliza felt a catch in her throat. Samuel had never met her father, but they spoke of him often, keeping his spirit alive with stories. What did you dream, honey? He said to tell you he's proud, that you made his dream even bigger and better than he ever thought it could be. Samuel yawned. Is that silly? No, sweetheart, Eliza said with tears welling in her eyes. That's not silly at all. After Samuel was tucked back in his bed, Caleb found Eliza in her father's old study. She was looking at the breeding records that went back 30 years. Her father's neat script filled the first pages. Her own handwriting took over in the middle, and now Caleb's notes were showing up all the time, too. "Your daddy really would be proud," Caleb said, leaning against the doorframe. "I know. I just wish he could see it. Wish he could meet his grandbabies. Wish he could know that everything he worked for wasn't lost. Maybe he can. Who's to say what's possible?" Caleb came and stood beside her. "But even if he can't, his legacy is right here in these books, in those fine horses, and in our children who are going to carry on the work. That's a kind of living on, ain't it?" Eliza closed the heavy record book. "When Samuel gets old enough, he ought to learn how to keep these records, keep the tradition going. And Grace too. That little girl has a mind for cattle that'd be a crying shame to waste just 'cause she's a girl. They'll both learn it all, and they can decide for themselves what part they want to play." "Your father would have liked that too," Caleb said. "He did raise you to run this place after all." They walked back to their bedroom, the house settled and quiet all around them. Eliza thought about how the room itself had changed. It was her parents' room, then hers alone after they passed, then theirs, together after she and Caleb got married. Now it was the heart of a home that held not just them, but their children, their ranch hands who'd become like family, and all the dreams they had turned into daylight reality. In the morning, Eliza woke up and Caleb was already out of bed, standing by the window, looking out over the ranch. She went to him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, and they watched the sun come up over the land they had fought for and won together. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "That I'm grateful for all of it. The good years and the hard ones, the successes and the stumbles, every single thing that brought us right here. Even that broken leg, even that. 'Cause it taught us we could face a crisis side by side, that we could take care of each other when it truly mattered." Samuel appeared in their doorway, with Grace trailing right behind him. Both kids were ready for breakfast and whatever adventures the day held. Eliza and Caleb shared a look that held 10 years of partnership, of a love that had been tested and proven true, of a whole life they built together from nothing more than faith and pure grit. They all went downstairs as a family. Eliza started on breakfast while Caleb got the children started on their morning chores. Through the kitchen window, she could see Tom and Sarah heading for the barn, see the cattle grazing way out in the distance, and see horses running free in pastures her own daddy had fenced in decades ago. This was her life now. Maybe not the one she'd ever expected, but it was 1,000 times better than anything she could have dreamed up. She had lost everything once, her parents, her security, the belief that just working hard was enough. And in losing all that, she'd found something worth so much more. She'd found a partner, love, a family, and a future built on trust instead of fear. Later that morning, after the breakfast dishes were clean and the children were doing their lessons, Caleb found Eliza in the barn checking on a mare that was getting close to her time. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe it's time we make this official." "Make what official?" "The ranch name. We've been calling it the Hartley Mercer Ranch for years now, but the deed just says Hartley. We ought to change that. Make it clear this place belongs to both of us." Eliza thought on it for a moment. Her father's name on that deed was the last official piece of him, the final word that this was his first. But holding on too tight to the past doesn't honor it. Building on it does. "Yes," she said. "Let's do that. The Hartley Mercer Ranch, official and on the books." They rode into town the very next week and filed the paperwork. The county clerk hardly batted an eye. Everybody in those parts already knew them as the Hartley Mercer outfit anyway. But seeing it written down for real, both their names claiming ownership side by side, felt like closing one book and starting a brand new one. On the ride home, Caleb said, "You know what I've never done?" "What's that?" "Properly thanked you." "For what?" "For saying yes. For taking a gamble on a man you didn't know from Adam. For building this life with me even when you were scared spitless." "I ought to be the one thanking you," Eliza said. "You saved everything." "We saved each other," Caleb cut in. "You gave me a place to put down roots, a purpose bigger than just staying alive and making a dollar, a family that's worth more than any debt I ever paid." They rode on in a comfortable quiet for a spell. The autumn sun was warm on their faces, and the land around them was as familiar as their own skin. "Caleb," Eliza said at last. "Yeah? I'm glad you showed up that day. I'm glad you were crazy enough to pay off a stranger's debt. I'm glad for all of it. The partnership, the marriage, the children, this whole life we made. Every last piece. Even when I drive you crazy. Especially then. Just means you care enough to get riled up." He laughed, and that sound filled Eliza with a peace so deep it nearly took her breath away. This was what her father had wanted for her. She knew it then. Not just a successful ranch, but a full life. A life with love and family and purpose and partnership. She'd found all of it, and then some. As they came over the last hill before home, the ranch spread out below them in all its hard-won glory. The house her father built, now bigger to hold their growing family. The barns and corrals and pastures, all improved and cared for. The cattle and horses, the result of years of careful breeding and hard work. And standing in the yard, watching for them to come home, were two children who were the future of it all. Samuel waved as soon as he saw them, and Grace took off running toward the road, not caring a bit about the dust, or her mama's sure to come lecture about her wild ways. That little girl ain't scared of nothing," Caleb said with a smile. "She gets that straight from you. Me, I am careful as they come. You paid $2,300 for a man you'd never laid eyes on. That is not what I call careful. It was not about being fearless. It was about being sure. I knew what had to happen, so I just made it happen." Eliza let those words sink in as they covered the last stretch home. She reckoned that was the real lesson from the past 10 years. It was not that fear was something you could just ignore. It was that when you were sure about what truly mattered, you could push right through it. She had been scared half to death the day she took Caleb on as a partner. Scared when she said yes to his proposal. Scared through every baby born, every loss, and every hardship they had weathered together. But deep down, beneath all that fear, she had been sure. Sure that this partnership was right. Sure that their love was a thing worth fighting for. Sure that the life they were carving out deserved every last bit of grit she had. They swung down from their saddles in the yard, and Grace came barreling into Eliza's legs with all the might a 7-year-old could manage. "Mama, you gotta come see. The mare had her baby." "Which mare?" Eliza asked, but her heart was already pounding. They were expecting 3 any day now. The one Papa said was special, the granddaughter of Ranger. Eliza and Caleb shared a quick glance and then hustled toward the barn. Inside the stall they had gotten ready, a mare stood watch over a brand-new filly. And that filly, well, that filly was a picture. She had Ranger's strong build, her mama's smart eyes, and a coat that seemed to glow in the soft barn light. "That is her," Eliza breathed, knowing deep in her bones this was the horse that would change everything for them. Papa would have been so proud of her. "What are we going to name her?" Samuel asked, suddenly right there at her side. Eliza looked at the little horse, at her children, her husband, and the barn her daddy had raised and she had made bigger. She looked at the life that was almost gone for good, but was rescued and turned into something more than she or her daddy could have ever dreamed up on their own. "Hope," she said finally. "We will call her Hope. Because that is what this has all been about, has not it? Hope that all the sweat and long hours would mean something. Hope that you could still count on people. Hope that loving someone was worth taking a chance. Hope that what was shattered could be put back together, that what was gone could be brought back, and that the impossible could be done with a partner, a little grit, and a whole lot of faith." Later that night, with the children tucked in and a deep quiet settled over the ranch, Eliza and Caleb sat out on the porch swing. The sky was filled with a million stars, and the air had that sharp bite that promised winter was on its way. The whole world around them felt calm. 10 years ago today," Caleb said, his voice low, "I was just a stranger who rode up to this place. ended up changing both our lives. It was the best choice we ever made, Eliza answered. I would do it all over again, Caleb said. Every single piece of it. Every tough decision, every scare, every second I was not sure what to do. Because it all brought me right here. To this porch, this life, and to you. To everything that means anything. Eliza took his hand, her fingers fitting into his like they always did. You did more than just pay off a debt that day. You gave us a chance at a future, both of us, and we put it together, one board at a time, into something neither one of us could have ever done by ourselves. That is what a partnership is, Caleb said quietly. That is what love is. Two folks making something grander than they could ever be apart. They sat there in the dark, holding hands, looking out over their land. This was the life they had earned. Somewhere inside, their kids were sleeping sound and safe. Out in the barn, the new filly, Hope, a symbol of all they had accomplished, was close to her mama. All across the ranch, their hands were getting their rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of good, honest work and being treated right. This right here, Eliza thought. This is what success feels like. It was not just about having money in the bank or a ranch that was doing well, though that was part of it. It was this right here, this partnership, this family, this feeling of knowing your purpose and where you belong. It was knowing you took something that was busted and fixed it for good. That you bet it all and came out with more than just safety. You came out with pure joy. That dust storm that blew through these parts 10 years back had swept away the woman she used to be. The one who was frightened, all by herself, and at the end of her rope. The woman sitting here now was stronger. She had learned that letting someone see you are hurt is not a weakness, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is ask for a hand. She had needed someone to save her that day in October, and Caleb was the one who did. But he had needed saving too, from a life that was all work and no meaning, from the kind of loneliness that comes from not having a place to call your own, from winning battles that did not matter to his heart. They had rescued each other. And by doing that, they had built something that would stand long after they were gone. A ranch, a family, a legacy built on working together and loving each other. I love you, Eliza whispered into the dark. I love you too, Caleb answered back. Now and always. And as she sat there on the porch of the house, they had made a home with everything they had earned all around them. Eliza knew. She knew without a single doubt that this life, this love, this partnership was everything her father had ever wished for when he first staked his claim on this piece of Texas. He did not just want them to survive, he wanted them to flourish. Not just to hang on, but to feel joy. Not just to have a ranch, but to have a home. They had taken his dream and made it grow. They made it better, and they made it their own. And one day they would give it to their children, who would build their own dreams right on top of it, raising up something that would last for ages. The cowboy had shown up just as they were about to take her ranch away. He paid every last cent she owed and told those men to get going. But he did so much more than that. He stayed. He became her partner. He loved her. He built this life with her. And side by side, they had made a future that was worth every hardship, every fight, and every single second they were not sure they would make it. This was their story. This was their victory. This was home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.